Morning and welcome to the first Transport Committee of 2022, coming live if you're watching this live from the London Fire Brigade headquarters. Can I first of all take apologies for absence and Chair's announcements. Please make sure everyone turns their electronic devices off or onto silent mode. Please don't put them on vibrate because that picks up on the microphones. Can I ask our clerk, Paul Goodchild, if we've had any apologies today?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence from Assembly Member Bailey.
Thank you very much indeed. And we're joined remotely by Assembly Member Deputy Mayor Joanne McCartney as well today. Welcome, Joanne. Declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and if members have got any other interest to declare? Nope, that's noted. Minutes. Can we confirm the minutes of the Transport Committee meeting held on the 14th of December 2021 to be signed by me as a correct record? Does somebody agree that? Thank you very much indeed. Summary list of actions. Can we note the ongoing actions arising from the previous meeting of the committee and the additional correspondence received? Noted. Thank you very much. And item 5, can we note the action I've taken as chair of the committee under delegated authority in consultation with the deputy chairman and party group lead members, namely to agree the appointment and extension of terms of offices of London Travel Watch board members? Noted. Thank you very much. That then moves us on to item 6, which is our main item on the agenda today, which is our second hearing looking at the issue of Vision Zero. And I'd like to welcome the guests we've got here today. We've got Lilli Matson, who's the Chief Safety, Health and Environment Officer at TfL, somewhere far down the end of the room. Welcome, Lilli. Thank you for coming today. Will Norman, who is the Walking and Cycling Commissioner. Welcome, Will. We have got Simon Ovens, who's the Chief Superintendent in the Met in charge of the Roads Policing Command. Welcome, great to see you. And Shravran Joshi, who's the Deputy Chairman of Streets and Walkways Committee at the City of London Corporation. Thank you so much for coming. And I should just say we were expecting today the Mayor Philip Glanville, the Chair of London Council's Transport and Environment Committee, and Clyde Lokes from the London Borough of Waltham Forest. Both unfortunately gave their apologies yesterday, which obviously we're disappointed to receive, but we will be looking to try and have an informal meeting with them to make sure we get as wider input from the London boroughs as possible. So we'll just note that and make sure that happens. I'm going to kick off the questions today, and perhaps if I could start with you, Lilli, if that's okay. I can't actually see your eyes. It's kind of slightly weird, isn't it, this new world we're in. Could you perhaps outline for us how successful you think Vision Zero has been to date, and are you going to be on track to meet your interim targets?
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me along. So Vision Zero is an absolute passion of mine and something I've championed within TfL. But it is true that actually there's been good progress on road safety in London for many years, actually, and it's been driven by the partnerships between the TfL and its predecessors, but particularly the London boroughs and the Metropolitan Police. What was really different with Vision Zero coming in 2018 with the plan that we launched is it's based, as you know, around the safe system approach, and it allows us to really forensically focus on the sources of danger, be that from vehicles or behaviour or the way streets are designed. And in that interim, since launching the Vision Zero plan, we've obviously been able to drive forward on the direct vision standard, the bus safety standard, and we are really reaping the benefits of that as a city. So we have seen very good progress, and I'll talk a little bit about the numbers of that, but it is worth noting that London's progress does outstrip other metropolitan cities in the UK, such as Manchester, and indeed in the other international cities like New York. So I think you can really see the impact of having a really clearly focused approach on reducing risk. In terms of the targets themselves, it is obviously, the pandemic obviously has fundamentally changed how people travel. So if we look back to 2019, which was the last sort of normal year that we might refer to, there was a 39% reduction overall in the number of people killed or seriously injured. And we compare that back to a baseline figure of 2005 to 2009 to allow us to track progress. In more recent times, so during the pandemic, obviously there was a great retraction in vehicle travel in the early spring of that year, and that did obviously reduce risk. It removed vehicles from the road, and overall we did see an even more impressive reduction of around 52% against that baseline. If we look at 2021, where actually for the last 18 months traffic levels have been near normal or actually increasing, unfortunately, in certain places, we have continued to see progress, and so we saw the lowest level ever of fatalities on London's roads in 2021. In the low, it's around 73. We're just waiting to finalise the figures, and the overall target will be around 43%. So we are continuing to make progress, and in some areas, I would pinpoint that the progress has been even faster. So probably most heartening with young people, where we've already exceeded a 65% reduction in the number of young people being injured. And indeed, with people being injured on or by a bus, it's over 70% reduction. And I think that does show that when you really target your efforts, you can make progress. However, it's not far enough. And I think our 65% reduction target for the coming year is extremely stretching. Overall, I think we're doing really well in some areas, and I think we'll have to push really, really hard if we're going to hit that overall. That's happy to delve into any detail.
Yeah, we'll be getting into some of that detail throughout it. Could you just clarify for us, and for those who are watching this, the baseline you use is 2005 to 2009. What is the reason for that being the baseline? Could you just set that context for us, please?
Absolutely. So traditionally, the Department of Transport did set national targets for road safety, and they always set a particular baseline period to get track targets against. So the previous one, I think, was 1994 to 1998. Then with changes in government, the national government doesn't set targets, but the Department of Transport continues to track and bear that responsibility for gathering collision data nationally and to set baseline periods to allow regional governments to track their data. So when we were setting the original targets back in 2017 and 18, as we ran into the Vision Zero Action Plan, that was the recommended baseline from the Department of Transport. And they were very clear they would move to the 2010-2014 as a baseline moving forward. And we will indeed do so when we reach the end of the current target we're tracking, which has an end date of 2022, and move to tracking against the 2030 target. That baseline then will become 2010-2014, and it's in line with the approach advised by Department of Transport.
Okay, that's helpful. And so presumably it's so you're able to compare more easily with like authorities. We're going to come on to the next section. We'll be looking at COVID and the impact of that. So put that to one side. But perhaps I could ask, Will maybe next, and Lilli, if you want to come in as well, what do you think are the other main challenges to achieving these targets?
Thanks. Morning, everybody. Nice to see you. Well, almost. It's as Lilli said, we have made good progress, but there is so much more to do. London has become a much safer place for people walking and cycling over the past 10 years. The risk of being killed or seriously injured per journey has fallen for people walking and cycling and across the board. But we've got, as I said, we've got so much further to go. Those vulnerable road users, people walking, cycling, motorbike users, account for about 80% of the people who are killed and seriously injured on our roads. So, you know, the partnership that we have, I think, is pretty unique and is being praised nationally. I know Her Majesty's the Inspector of the Her Majesty's
HMI, I just call them HMI.
HMI, yeah. But the police inspection has praised the partnership between the Met and the police. I'm really pleased Simon's here. But also, obviously, the boroughs are responsible for 95% of London's roads. Absolutely critical that they're involved. Our Healthy Streets approach is essential and is central to everything that we are doing. So making the streets safer for people using the streets is true. But there are some Some areas I'm still really concerned about, despite the progress that has been made. I continue to be concerned about cycling and around the vulnerable users and motorists. There are new risks emerging all the time. I sort of look at it in terms of we're running to stand still. You know, there are new technologies emerging. The e-scooters you'll all be familiar with are a challenge. We're seeing a change in the number of people and the focus on the injuries and collisions of people driving to work, which is a challenge. The rising levels of traffic, you mentioned this earlier on. More traffic on the roads brings greater danger. And then there is, of course, the existential threat to the whole plan, which is the uncertainties around funding, both in terms of the quantum and the time periods of the sort of funding arrangements that we have with government. So do you want to just quickly touch on those areas I am concerned about in a bit more detail, or do you want to come over later on?
I think they'll come out in our discussion,
sure.
Will. That's really helpful. Lily, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well,
and also, perhaps you could answer what more you think needs to happen with government around any legislative changes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, Will did a great job summarising it. But also, as the committee will be aware, we've very recently published our refresh report, and that was delving into some of the new risks that we're seeing emerging. So if I just consider the food delivery economy is doubled in size between 2019 and 2020. So we are seeing a lot more people using particularly small motorbikes to do these valuable services, and some of those are not having proper training and putting themselves at risk. So there's the whole issue around that, the gig economy. The impact of, and Will touched on new technology, but journey apps in particular have led to quite significant rises in traffic on minor roads. And this is really pushing against our efforts to make these places places where people can live and play. And so really significant impacts of traffic on sea roads driven by journey planning apps, which has led to increasing collisions as well. And another piece of research which we will be publishing later, which it adds to existing knowledge that we know that the tragedy of collisions does impact communities differently in London, but that continues to be the place, that continues to be the truth. And so children living in deprived areas are 2 to 3 times more likely to be injured in a collision. People with disabilities are around 4 times more injured. That's a sort of national figure, but we think it holds true here as well. And peoples of different ethnicities have different experiences. So we are really looking at how we can target our interventions moving forward and working critically with the boroughs, as Will said, because they hold so much of the road network in their hands, to really target those interventions to address those groups that are losing out most notably. And so I think moving forward, some of the big issues we need to continue to push forward with. The freight safety, we have the next iteration, the strengthening of the direct vision standard. The bus safety standard, we must continue to roll it out because these vehicles are large and they are very present on our streets, so we've made good progress. But we have the vision of 0 injuries from buses. But we are working currently and right now directly with the delivery industries themselves to try to drive safety there. And with central government, we've been meeting very regularly to talk about what more we could do around 20 mile an hour. Now, around half of London's roads currently are 20 mile an hour. But we think there's merit in considering London for a standard, making 20 the default on the 30 mile an hour road space. It would be much easier for drivers, clear and more simple, and also easier to implement because you wouldn't need as much changes between signs and lines. And we most recently met them, DFT, on the 17th of December. They are quite interested in some aspects of it. They are quite concerned about enforcement and other elements, but really willing to work with us on that. Other areas that we want to really see the DFT take more action on is around strengthening the compulsory basic training for motorcycle drivers. Mm-hmm. It's too easy to get on a motorbike with no training at all and just to keep repeating that. And we think, there's good evidence that we should strengthen that. And we're waiting for further action to decriminalise the enforcement of some moving traffic offences on cycle lanes and mandatory cycle lanes. There's a wide range of interventions, and we do keep sort of weekly in touch with the DFT on that. We'd like to see some faster progress.
That's really helpful, thank you. And we're going to go into some of that detail. And I have to say motorcyclists and food deliveries has become my latest obsession following e-scooters in terms of dangers on the highway and for those individuals. Could I just bring in our other guests now? And let's start with you, Simon, if I may. Do you think that the Vision Zero targets for 2041 are achievable? And obviously funding is part of it, but, you know, are there other concerns you have?
Good morning, everybody. I wear hearing aids, so I'm having a bit of trouble hearing you, but so if I look at you vaguely, that's the reason, but hopefully I'll be okay. Is it achievable? It's an extraordinary aspiration to be able to think about achieving, and an amazing target to get to. There are human beings involved in all of this, though, and unless we entirely eradicate human beings from the process of driving and stepping out on pavements and things like that, it's difficult to see a total achievement. But with all the work we're doing and the incredible reductions that we have seen, you know, 73 people died on our roads last year, which is 73 absolute tragedies. But compared with the baseline of 211, you'll see significant progress is being made. And if we carried on at that rate, and with all the things that colleagues have mentioned, we will see, I'm sure, a further erosion of that figure. But we do get odd things where people will just, will unfortunately become a victim of some quite strange things, of, you know, slow reversing and things like that are very, very difficult to totally eradicate. But an amazing aspiration. Reminds me a bit of the NSPCC Full Stop campaign some time ago, where a beautiful vision to think one day we will have no one killed on our roads in this capital city.
Okay, thank you for that. And Shafran, what's your thought from a borough perspective, the City of London, on this?
Thank you, and thank you everyone for inviting us to speak here today. We think Vision Zero is an absolute must for London, well, for the UK. As Chief and Superintendents just pointed out, wouldn't it be great to have that statistic in front of zero deaths and fatalities on the roads? We think there are a number of challenges and difficult decisions and political decisions that need to be made to achieve that. Around reducing traffic, we're going to have to reduce traffic, we're going to have to reduce speeds that people travel at. We're going to have to look at next generation charging technologies. But we also think there are huge secondary benefits which also align with the general direction of travel. So things around healthy lifestyles that can be promoted through active transport. We think that actually achieving lower air pollution is part of this mix, and we also think that achieving net zero targets and decarbonisation by having less vehicular traffic on the roads is also part of that mix. So we think there's a broader picture here, but we're very supportive of it. We've put in place in the city several, we think, quite effective measures already, and have seen the benefits of that in our sort of NO2 and sort of particulate figures as well for the air pollution. So we're very supportive.
Lovely, thank you. Will, do you want to come in?
Could I just come in briefly on the achievability of it? I think, as Simon pointed out, every death and serious injury on the roads is a tragedy. It's not just the deaths, it's the serious injuries. Many of those are life-changing. Sometimes the difference between a death and a serious injury is centimetres or seconds in terms of the changes. So those are really important. They bring heartache and tragedy to everybody involved. I cannot envisage what other goal we would have of bringing that to zero. Now, we can all work, and there are changing patterns, there are changing technologies, things will move. This has to be a live document, this has to be a live policy. We don't know all the answers yet. We still don't. This is why we produced the progress report, it's why we're bringing in new actions. But to have any other, what other goal would we have? How many deaths are acceptable on a road? How many serious injuries are acceptable? I would argue none, yeah? We need to work to that tone. And Other cities have managed it. Other capital cities have managed it. Oslo, Helsinki are good examples where they managed it. Now, I'm not saying London is the same as those cities. London is bigger, London is more complex, it's got other issues, there's different contexts, but other cities have managed it, and I just cannot envisage, I would not want to sit here and say, actually, this number of heartaches, tragedies, people losing their parents, their kids, is acceptable on London's roads. The goal is right, the policy is right, it's working, but we don't know all the answers, and we need to continue to learn as we deliver this.
Lovely, thank you. And clearly, as we're hearing, emerging challenges such as, I thought it was interesting what Lilli had said, the Journey app and the impact that's having in areas and so on, as well as new technologies. Right, Assembly Member Clark, you wanted to come in.
Thank you, Chair. I just have a question for you, Lilli. I wanted to follow up on some specific legislative changes for the pedicabs in London Bill. This is of particular interest to my constituents in Bloomsbury. The second reading of the bill was on the 19th of November was interrupted, and the second reading was due on the 3rd of December, but that did not take place. What is your understanding on when the bill will return? And do you think the government are giving this matter the priority it requires?
So I'll let Will come, because I know he wants to comment on it, but I would just sort of say this continues to be a concern for us, so I'll hand it to him.
So, as many of you know, the pedicab issue has been a long-running bone of contention. We are not anti-pedicabs. The green, clean way of getting around are fantastic, but they do need regulation. They do need to be able to prices. For example, my father-in-law got one where he's disabled, came out, got charged £40 going down the Strand the other evening because there were no taxis or other vehicles available for him to, and he's a blue badge holder, didn't drive into London, £40 to go down the Strand is astronomical. It does need that regulation. We're very supportive of that bill. Nikki Aiken MP is the MP who's bringing forward that, and she's got our support. We're meeting, I met Nikki just before Christmas to talk about the update on that. As you said, the bill was blocked as a private member's bill, but we have been working with the MP who blocked that, Sir Christopher Chope. We've got a meeting coming up with him to try and address that. We understand that he is receptive to this. I think he's got some legitimate concerns that he does not want legislation to ban things through the back door and those sort of things. So we'll continue to work with members of Parliament to bring in that legislation to hopefully make sure that we get a green, clean option for those people who want it, but it's regulated so it's safe. There are the checks available, and the fare structure is fair for everybody.
Thank you for that. It's really helpful. Thanks.
Assembly Member Baker.
Thanks. I've got a couple of questions also about the discussions with government. Well, I'll wrap them up in one, which is around, to Lilli, I think. Are you having discussions with the government around their refresh of the 2011 National Road Safety Framework, particularly around improving road safety education? And also, are there still discussions going on about the restarting work on the graduated driving licence?
Thanks, great questions. So yes, we are having ongoing discussions with them about the refresh of their road safety framework. The education is clearly part of that. In particular, we've been promoting Bike Safe and the wider rollout of road safety education. So, we're feeding in positively to that. Hopefully, that's being listened to. The second part was about the graduated driver. So we really are very strongly in favour of this. Our understanding is that isn't necessarily being progressed by government, which we think is a shame and doesn't reflect the evidence and the consultation responses that were actually received on that, because we do feel there would be really significant safety benefits. So we'll continue to make those points into government. We feel it's very important. I don't know, Will, if you wanted to add anything. No.
I haven't got anything to add other than what Lilli said.
Yeah, I've got a couple others, and then I'll bring him in. Yes, could you want to just explain what that graduated driving licence is, just for, I'm not sure I fully know, to be honest, but for those watching as well.
So in very general terms, obviously, people, can get their provisional licence and then pass, and then they are allowed to have full access to all aspects of the road network and all speeds up into the speed limit. The graduated approach limits the speeds or the range which people can have access for a period of time until they become more experienced in the size of the vehicles. And so it's to allow a more gradual, if you like, experience of gaining that road user experience. And that has been tried in different areas, and I apologize, I can't quite remember where, but we can certainly provide more input on that if you want. There's been quite an extensive consultation, which I referred to, it was a fair while ago, and there just hasn't been any progress from central government in terms of taking it forward.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's interesting. It's always very unusual that people could go onto a motorway as soon as they've passed their test, yet have never had a lesson or anything on the motorway. It always struck me as bizarre. Thank you. Assemblymember Garrett.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I should declare an interest. So I set off to come here this morning on my bike, and my wife and my 11-year-old son also left the house this morning to go to work and school on their bikes. And it's my sincere hope that we all get home safely again this evening. So I think my commitment to this is quite high. I've got a couple of areas I'd like to ask questions about, if I may. Firstly is about the baseline, which I have real problems with. And I accept the explanation that you gave earlier, Lilli, about aligning with national data collection periods. But I think a normal person looking at the baseline that you've used, I think it's so odd as to look dishonest. That's the way that it seems to me. Because I'm looking here at a graph showing the KSI stats for the baseline period, and then all of the improvements in safety that happened since then, effectively during the decade before Vision Zero started. And then you sit here this morning and you quote a lot of statistics about achievements of Vision Zero. And am I right in saying that the lion's share, possibly even nearly all of those improvements, except possibly in the very last year, with the COVID year, were achieved before Vision Zero even started and before the current mayor was in office?
Great question, but I think well, let me just roll back even further. What we have fortunately seen as a city, and I mentioned it in my introduction, is a steady decline in the number of people being injured. And that has continued, exactly as you indicated, for many, many years. And to be really clear on that, a lot of those improvements aren't anything to do with TfL. They happened before TfL happened, or to do with the boroughs. They're to do with vehicle safety improvements. And that has had a major, major impact in terms of making vehicles safer. But when we track safety improvements more recently, we can indeed see year-on-year improvements. So the reduction between 2019 and 2020, I think, was 20%. There's a further year-on-year reduction this year. So we're really happy to provide, and we do indeed provide all data very openly, and you can track it by those. But what I just want to sort of say is, you are right that there were reductions from 2005, 2009 up to the period 2018, because a lot of really good work was going on. But where we have seen a real acceleration of impact is in areas such as the bus safety, and that does reflect the work that has been really focused in that area. Go on.
I mean, I have some questions about bus safety, which I think we'll come on to in a later section. But I think the picture that you just gave earlier, though, you quoted a lot of safety improvements, and I think I'm right in saying you didn't quite answer my question. All or nearly all or a significant percentage of that safety improvement that you're claiming credit for at the beginning of this meeting happened not just before Vision Zero, but before this mayor even took office. Is that correct?
So I'm speaking on behalf of Transport for London. Transport for London has been rigorously...
Sorry, you were claiming that as part of Vision Zero, though. So when did Vision Zero start? Was that 2018?
So the Vision Zero Action Plan was published in 2018. It builds on the Road Safety Action Plan, which we published, I think, in 2012 or 2014. There were always safety schemes being delivered in London during that period. There were also efforts to control speed. But what's really different about the Vision Zero Action Plan is the statement that no death is acceptable and the real focus on reducing risk. And what that has allowed us to drive forward at a much more accelerated rate is efforts such as protected cycling schemes.
Sorry, I apologise for keeping interrupting. It's not that I want to talk about the specific schemes. I think we'll probably have a lot of time today to talk about that. What I want to talk about is the baseline I heard what you said earlier about the national periods of safety monitoring, but if we're claiming impact of Vision Zero, why are we taking a baseline that starts 10 years before Vision Zero? Why not take a baseline that starts either during the period around when it started, let's say 2016, 17, 18, or maybe a 5-year period leading up to 2018? Wouldn't that be a more honest baseline of where things were when Vision Zero started, so that you can then compare this is the impact of what's happening under Vision Zero?
So I can accept your challenge, but the point is, as a technical officer, we've been tracking targets within London since we were set up, and indeed the London Road Safety Unit existed before TfL existed. So there is a continuation of targets and tracking, and it wouldn't have been appropriate to sort of break that continuation. So we had a previous target which followed the previous government's baseline, which was 1994 to 98. When that one was concluded, we moved to the new baseline. And it feels to me that this shouldn't be a politicised issue. It's too important for that, and that we're tracking the progress. I'll come to the fact you want to know the progresses, but in terms of the technical tracking of the collisions of people being killed or seriously injured, we feel it's very important in terms of having a clear public trajectory that shows how we move from one baseline to the other. In terms of being able to demonstrate, has the Vision Zero action plan been successful, I think we can, I think it's quite clear if you look at the refresh report. It tracks what actions have been completed and what haven't. And it also looks at specific impacts of schemes, such as quoting the evidence, not just from TfL, but others, in terms of the impacts of low traffic neighbourhoods. And we can always, if you would like, provide more bespoke analysis period by period, which will show you exactly what the progress has been from any one period in time, because we, as a city, are incredibly lucky to have very detailed and rich collision data, which we take very seriously. But just to be really clear and on the record, there's absolutely no dishonesty in this. We track this because this is completely aligned with the government's approach to monitoring road safety.
Okay, sorry, Will, you were indicating you wanted to...
I was just going to come in and say that there has been progress during this mayoralty. You know, if you take 2015, there were 136 people who were killed on the roads. And I don't want to make this political, because actually good progress was made under the previous mayor with the introduction of the cycle lanes and the changes. But 136 in 2016, there were, I think, 116 people, 112 in 2018, 119, 125, 120, 96. What's interesting is the spread of those causes of those collisions. So, you know, in 2015, 66 pedestrians were killed. People walking were sadly killed. In 2020, that was 45. You know, it's gone down on every scheme there. Now, as I said before, one, this is not political. There's been a heartfelt cross-party agreement that we shouldn't have people being killed on our roads previous to this mayor, but progress has been made in this mayor. I think the Vision Zero sort of umbrella and the safer systems approach is a new way of modernising the good work that's been going and has brought that along. But it's wrong to say that there has not been progress made under this administration, because the evidence shows that there has been, but we do have an awful long way to go.
Okay, I feel perhaps we've explored that as much as we can. Thank you for your answers. I had a quick second question, actually, which is about a piece I saw in the press this week about a TV, I think it was an online, actually, video advert called See Their Side. And I had two questions about that, which I'll do together. And it may be that both of you wish to answer them. The first one is, how on earth did we end up with an advert that was supposed to be about the laudable aim of drivers and cyclists seeing each other's side, in which the driver was clearly at fault, and somehow we end up with this message that we should all be getting along together without reinforcing the fact that in the image shown, it was not the cyclist but the driver clearly at fault? And secondly, did either or both of you sign off on that advert before it went out?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that question. So in the Vision Zero refresh report, one of the more sobering statistics is some of the work we've done looking at attitudes to safety in London, which does just show the magnitude of the issue. I think 87% of Londoners still consider that collisions are inevitable and that it's something you sort of accept. And there's a large body and need of work to sort of bring people along to taking more care on the road network, considering that safety is the be-all and end-all of making a journey. And so we've talked, and we talk in the report, about the real need to try to influence cultures and behaviours on the road network. This piece of work drew exactly on that research and was quite carefully researched beforehand. Just to correct you on one thing, if you look at the advert, the driver does not actually, it's not clear. The whole point of the advert is it's not clear if anyone is at fault. The driver neither swerves nor does anything. All you see is an altercation, and it's a nasty altercation, and the whole point is that it has both participants reflecting on it. Now, I did see the advert, and I did comment on it, and we did make some changes to it, so I did absolutely see it before it went out. The issue, what we really wanted, and what was very interesting, because we did some follow-up research with focus groups, is a lot of different groups did actually have the sort of light bulb moment that the advert was looking to generate, which was that moment of empathy and recognition, actually, that the other road users also are there as human beings and are perhaps scared by what's going on. It didn't have the stakeholder reaction that we wanted, and therefore it was muddying the very issue that we were trying to do. This is to try to intervene in something as complex as road safety culture is a very difficult thing. It was quite a brave attempt to try to do this. We don't think the advert was effective ultimately. We've stopped it. But it was trying to do something new and trying to generate that kind of awareness and empathy, and we need to look at it and to learn from it and to see what else we can do to try to progress. What is at heart absolutely essential is that we try to generate a wider sense of awareness about the huge responsibility we all have as road users and the danger that we all pose to each other, which out with we won't actually achieve Vision Zero.
Sorry, my second question was, you signed off on that advert. I mean, you said that.
So I'm not I definitely saw it as part of the process of approving it within TfL. And yes, if you like, I signed off on it. It's not actually, just in terms of the Byzantine governance TfL, it's not actually my final say. But yes, I'm happy to take that accountability if that's helpful.
Thanks. Sorry, Will. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, I can. Sorry, they're a bit temperamental.
Yeah, just to confirm on Lilli, we have to tackle the culture on London's roads. Yeah, it is. We've done an awful lot of marketing around the behaviour on London's roads in terms of the speeding, the drink driving, all of those things, and they're effective. But all the research shows that sort of 90% of people still consider it inevitable that people will get killed and seriously injured on our roads. There is a deep-rooted culture, and all the research shows that there's a culture of sort of everyone in it for themselves on London's roads. That's what the semiotic research shows. We have, as I said, it's tackling culture and change. I say this as an anthropologist, is a huge challenge, and we have to be able to think innovatively and differently about this. So it is not easy. Clearly, the reaction to this advert isn't what anybody would have wanted. It has been stopped, but I still believe, and actually talking to a lot of the stakeholders, I'm sure everyone here would agree that we do need to do work on pushing that how we change the culture on London's roads. It is a challenge. We do need to think innovatively, and I wouldn't want the issues that happened with that advert to affect the team to be able to think differently and actually address this in a really what is a real challenging problem.
Okay.
What I heard in your answer was that it was the reaction to the advert that was the problem. Do I infer from that you didn't think the advert itself was a problem, but you accept that the reaction wasn't what you expected?
No, I did not see the advert before it went out, and I wasn't a fan of it when I did.
Thanks. Thanks,
Okay.
Chair.
Right, I'm just conscious members.
Sorry, can I just add? Sorry, Chair. Can I just add one thing? That process, we have actually worked through the issues on that process, so that there is now a new system in place whereby marketing and content and the working with colleagues in MOPAC and the Met and others are coming together to do this jointly. And as I said, this is stuff we are learning to do all the time. And so there is a new process and a new system in place, so that as we move forward, things can continue to go well.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. Just conscious members, we are still at the end of question 1. We've got a lot to get through, so maybe pick up a little pace already, otherwise we're going to be here into the afternoon. I've got Assembly Member Prince on this question, then I'm bringing in Assembly Member Desai, and then you can move straight as well into your question.
Thank you, Chair. This really is for Lilli. Because of COVID, I think...
Well, the next question is on COVID, so just be careful.
Okay, but because of COVID, I think that there must be a question over how we can rely on the data during the period of COVID because of the different traffic levels.
Yes, I mean, absolutely concur with that. That COVID, it had a very significant impact on how people travelled. I would say, and obviously we're tracking casualties by, they're impacted by the number of journeys that are made and the types of journeys. Just to highlight a couple of elements within that, I think would be particularly of interest to you. So in 2020, where there was a real retraction, we all remember between March and May, roads were empty. We obviously saw a very welcome general reduction in collisions. However, there was an increase in speed-related collisions because people used the empty roads to illegally speed and cause enormous road danger. And there was also, of course, and this is consistent with 2021 as well, because of the largely working at home arrangements, a lot of central London is much, much, much emptier than it would be. So we've seen a real significant fall, very grateful, welcome fall in pedestrian collisions. But that isn't necessarily the true picture of what London will hopefully look like when it gets up and running again. You have more pedestrian journeys. So we're very conscious that those are unusual behaviours or patterns of travel. A further one that's quite significant is in 2021, thank goodness, we saw a real reduction in the number of people being killed on motorcycles. So tragically, 10 people were killed, but that's quite a reduction on previous years. And it seems that relates in particular to a reduction in people using large or being involved in collisions on large motorbikes, which would traditionally commute in longer distances from the southeast. And I think that, again, reflects the working from home period. So all is to say that is the top level figures, you really need to delve into them. And exactly as we say in the refresh report we've been saying this morning, this is a really dynamic and live picture, and we need to be really fleet of foot to respond to the risks as they arise. We don't ultimately know what travel behavior patterns will settle back into post-pandemic. Working from home 2 or 3 days a week will actually potentially have impacts on the safety patterns that we see, because people might be making more local journeys and they won't be making such longer journeys. So, that all has to be taken into account in terms of the actions we put in place. And it does, you're absolutely right, mean that there needs really careful interpretation of top-line figures.
Come back on the motorcycle thing. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. Assembly Member Desai.
Well, Chair, my two specific questions were for Chief Superintendent Owens, who's not here, so I can help you.
He's coming back in, he's making a call. We'll hold that and bring it in later. Do you want to move on to your next section?
Specific question, drink driving. So, I'll ask him when he comes back. So if I move on to question two. So my main question, my lead-off question, has to some extent already been answered by TfL, but I'll still put the question to you. And it would also have been for the Met Police as well, for their perspective on how far has the pandemic affected progress towards Vision Zero. So perhaps when the Superintendent comes back, I can put that question to him. So I know in terms of TfL and the effect of the pandemic on progress towards Vision Zero, you already partially answered that question in your response to the main question from the Chair. But can you just give us a vision of where you're going and what the current situation is? Can you expand on your answers to the Chair?
So COVID related.
No, that's absolutely fine. I'm just noting a couple of points. So where to start? One of the reactions in terms of travel behaviour from the pandemic has been to increase car traffic, because people are using cars more, and that directly followed the government's advice at the beginning to avoid using public transport, which thankfully that is not now part of the advice on travelling safely, because we know that the public transport network is safe. But there is a greater traffic in outer London, for example, has increased, and that is making the challenge of achieving Vision Zero harder. It was something that we will have to sort of continue to try to overcome by making the roads safer and more attractive to people to make those walking and cycling journeys and travelling by bus in particular. But the pandemic has also had some opportunities in terms of pushing forward on terms of Vision Zero initiatives. There was a massive increase in people cycling, for example, and we know when we look at the rates of people being injured cycling, actually the risk, the rate of injury per journey has reduced by about a third. And we were able, working very closely with the boroughs, and with the boroughs often in the lead, to introduce an enormous number of temporary walking and cycling measures, which Will knows about in detail, and many low-traffic neighbourhoods. And the evidence from researchers such as the University of Westminster have shown that those had a really significant impact on reducing risk and making the roads safer. So at one level, it's made our job harder, and at others, we were able to move forward at pace with some schemes which have really helped to improve London's road network. And I guess hopefully that's helpful. The final thing I would say, and we can come on to detail when you want to talk about it, is really the impact on TfL's funding. Because we set a really ambitious plan to continue to move forward on this agenda in the recent progress report. But it's no secret that that progress is absolutely dependent on securing a longer-term funding deal with the government that will allow us to work with the boroughs to progress this agenda.
Actually, I do have a question on funding, but Will, have you got anything to add to what your colleague has said?
Just very briefly, I think I'm not going to add to what Lilli said because it was comprehensive, and that COVID has brought challenges and opportunities in this area. And I'll just give you an example of one of my concerns moving forward as we come out of COVID is what have we learned during this period? If I look at my portfolio of making the road safer, actually tackling some of those, we did an awful lot. We delivered over 120 kilometres of cycle routes in little less than sort of 18 months. That's made a massive difference, over 100 low traffic neighbourhoods. That was done quickly and cheaply. You can't do everything in quick and cheap measures. So there are some dangerous junctions in London whereby you can't do something with some wands, some plastic and some lines, and it does require new signals, a new junction layout. But there is an awful lot of stuff we can do. So if you take, for example, Holborn Gyratory, which was an area where there has been 8 fatalities since 2005. It's a dangerous junction. It's well known as a dangerous junction. There was funding in place for Camden to be able to make permanent changes to that gyratory and make it safer for all road users. That money, we couldn't commit to that money because of the timescales and the funding packages and the emergency situation that Lilli outlined due to TfL funding. But as an interim measure, we did take some of the learnings that we had, sort of the boroughs and all the skilled officers in the boroughs and TfL to actually bring in, well, what can we do as an interim step? So there is now, TfL's got a great system of go, look, see, which is where there's been a serious injury or a fatality, go and look at the junction, see what happened. But I'm very keen on this go, look, see, do. What can be done immediately? So there's an example in Holborn where there's some changes that have been happening that probably some of that comes from the learning that we had during COVID. Same in Wood Lane where there was a fatality recently. Go, look, see, do. What could be changed in the short term in those places? Learning off what we've done during the COVID space. So there are opportunities, but there are also challenges with COVID on this agenda. And I think our responsibility is to take what worked, apply it to the scheme and evolve our ways of doing things as we move forward.
Thank you. If I can ask you, both of you, Lilli and Will, what consultation has taken place between yourselves and stakeholder groups during the pandemic about how to protect Londoners and the users they represent, groups such as London Living Streets, the London Cycling Campaign?
I'll just kick off and then hand to Will. At the London-wide level, one of the stakeholder forums we introduced with the original Vision Zero action plan was the Vision Zero reference group. So this is a group of stakeholders including so groups such as London Cycling Campaign, as well as safety groups, which we meet with regularly and discuss policy challenges, share data. We shared with them, for example, that advert that you mentioned earlier to share the early workings on that and get their input onto it as part of the development. That has been ongoing, but at the local level, there's also been extensive at local level, I was saying there's also been extensive stakeholder relations. So, Will, did you want to talk a bit about those?
Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, building on that, so at a sort of citywide level on that Vision Zero piece, there's that group that Lilli talked through, but also just on the sort of more on the changes to the streets, which I know during the pandemic and the rapid rollout under the emergency legislation that government provided, provided sort of not to do that consultation that we know is so important to bring communities along with us. So, as a reaction to that, given that the legislation and the guidance that was issued by government, we did sort of establish a street space advisory group, which was brought together people like LCC, the business improvement districts, London councils, London Travel Watch, the RAC, the RNIB, so a whole raft of people who are interested in this to shape that programme, and that helped change things, it helped move things on, and that, that's where we sort of discuss things like the inclusive streets, 24/7 bus lanes. Now that we've moved beyond that and the legislation has changed, we have gone back to a wider level of consultation, and all of those temporary schemes that were put in are currently being sort of looked at as should they be removed, should they stay, and that is going through the usual process of consultation. And I would advise anyone listening or watching to go to the TfL Have Your Say page and the boroughs as well, because there is an awful lot of live consultation going on to both to look at that, but also to see what could be improved in those measures if they go into more experimental measures as the traffic flows continue to change, or they go into permanent measures, or they're removed.
I do have a question to ask of Shravan in due course about the role of the boroughs, but if I can just finish with TfL, and then I'll come to you, Shravan. So about the all-important issue of funding and money, and to some extent, again, you already touched upon aspects, touched upon the issue of funding and funding settlement. But overall, what impact will your financial situation have on your ability to reach Vision Zero targets? Very specifically, the TfL submission to the GLA budget outlines what projects will be removed, reduced, or deferred unless government funding is provided in the streets, buses, and other surface operations area. Capital enhancements, which have dropped from 371 million to 214 million, and capital renewals have dropped from 260 million to 128 million. So can you give some context on what programs would no longer be supported?
Yeah, no, thank you for highlighting this. I mean, I would caveat or introduce all that I say with the fact that we are very much working with government now to try to seek that longer term funding deal. So the ultimate very sort of uncomfortable outcome of a managed decline scenario, which has been much talked about before Christmas, could hopefully be averted. But without significant funding at a high level, I think it's worth the Assembly knowing that we have done some assessment, and we know, for example, that if we had the funding required to deliver the Vision Zero action plan, by 2030 we could avert around 3,500 serious injuries and around 117 deaths. If we don't have the funding, we won't. Those collisions and injuries are very, very likely to result, because we'll know that will be the kind of performance will not improve. The kinds of things that are at risk are the kinds of projects that we have so benefited from in the past. So the ability to complete the safer junctions work, for example, would need to pause. The ability to accelerate the transition to 20 mile an hour of sections of the TLRN, which we've highlighted as being our ambition within the Vision Zero action plan, would need to pause. There would be a slowing of the ability to roll out intelligent speed adaptation in the bus. We'd still be doing some, but it wouldn't be at the pace we wanted. So there is almost all of the measures that we highlight within the action plan will be impacted by a lack of funding, and that will result in people continuing to be injured on our road network, which we feel is avertible, and we've shown through the progress that we've been able to deliver that when you put the measures in place which have the evidence to support them, you will drive down that risk and you will drive down death and injury.
Could I just add to that? And there are some things that keep me up at night. This is at the very top of that list. Without a long-term funding deal, we are not we are not going to able to continue to build safe cycle networks. We aren't going to be able to do those safer junctions. Yeah, we aren't going to be able to improve those borough roads. This is an existential threat to the progress on Vision Zero. And what I'm pleased about is that I know there are people in government who really share our goals and ambitions here. Again, let's not make this party political in any way. There is shared agreement, and the previous mayor did an awful lot in this space as well. So I'm hopeful that that will be an outcome. But it isn't just an impact on TfL here. As we've said all the way through this, Vision Zero is a partnership. It's a partnership between the Metropolitan Police, the Mayor, TfL, and the boroughs. The impact on funding goes way beyond just the TfL bottom line and the schemes that TfL do. 95% of the roads are the authority of the boroughs. TfL provides most of the funding for improvements in the boroughs through the local implementation plans. That will, in the managed decline scenario, there will not be the funding for the boroughs to be able to make those changes either. We also provide £91 million towards the funding of the Roads Traffic Police Command, which has, over 2,000 officers, uniformed officers in there. That's an absolutely core priority to the enforcement on our streets. Vision Zero is a partnership. We do need a long-term funding deal to be able to plan. It's not just the quantum of the money, it's the time which it does, because obviously changing some of the junctions or planning some of this stuff goes beyond the period of months and weeks. The impact is already happening, though. Let's be clear, this is not a future impact, it's already happening. Holborn Gyratory, I alluded to, was a scheme that had £9 million, almost £10 million worth of funding set aside. That's had to be put on pause. Wood Lanes, there's a cycle route there where there was a fatality. The bicycle training, which is an important part of the education piece, has had significant cuts to the amount of money being funded through the boroughs here. So the reality is this is happening now. This is not some sort of worst case scenario moving into the future, and that's why it's so urgent. And it goes way beyond my lack of sleep that this is important. We come back to those horrible figures of over 3,000 people being killed and seriously injured on our roads.
Thank you. Existential threat, the need for a long-term funding deal, I couldn't agree more. So if I can turn to you, Shravan, as the only representative of local government with us today, and we talked about a partnership between the TfL, the police, and the boroughs. And you already talked about, to some extent, about the role of the boroughs, about the role of the city, and I think you referenced air quality. But can I just put to you generally about the role of the boroughs overall in the Vision Zero work of TfL, and particularly the impact of COVID in this work? And you may wish to give examples from the corporation, the City of London, that I'm proud to represent in this building.
Thank you for that. And I would reiterate exactly what Will has just said about some of those issues and concerns. We share those, and I think if I can bring that sort of local perspective in. Firstly, on sort of TfL and funding, certainly we think that with 95% of the road network under the borough control, that certainly there needs to be more equitable funding to enable us to bring up the reality of Vision Zero on London streets. And I would sort of moving slightly beyond the sort of political situation of short-term funding for TfL, I think there needs to be some braver decisions made by our leaders on longer-term strategies and approaches that will help us achieve Vision Zero. And I'll use the example of Monument Junction. I know you've talked about Holborn Gyratory, but Monument Junction's in a similar position. It's been highlighted as a junction that is a cause for concern. It's been on that sort of waiting list for a long, long time. And we kind of need to move beyond the potential traffic disruption in wanting to achieve a longer term benefit for people, for commuters and for passengers and whatever mode of transport they're in. And so I think there needs to be a certain amount of political bravery as well brought into this debate to enable some of this to be realised. And certainly the longer term funding, I think, is something we would certainly gain confidence in for us to be able to achieve that 2040 Vision Zero. On the consultation side, and I think this goes back to the COVID piece specifically, over 90% of the journeys in the square mile are pedestrian. And so that's a real concern for us when we talk about fatalities and injuries on our streets, because they're not in metal cages. we certainly give a priority to that pedestrian personality in our outlook on transport. What we have is quite a unique situation, though, where we don't have many residents in the square mile, but we have a lot of commuters coming in and out in normal times. And so running the regular cycle of consultation that we would on experimental traffic orders and so on just couldn't be done. We took the approach of actually putting in various measures, the wands, if you like, increasing pavement widths, introducing temporary cycle lanes and so on. And we've taken feedback from various groups as people have returned to work, as people have returned to the city. We've taken those feedbacks on board, especially from, groups representing disabled and people with accessibility issues, to then alter the way the city streets are laid out. And that's an ongoing iterative process that we're in. And we will then go down the route of experimental traffic orders and the general, more sort of normal consultation routes that we would undertake.
Thank you. Chair, I know, is it okay? I'm conscious of the time.
Simon, absolutely.
Simon, welcome back. We know that you have to attend to a call. So I've got two specific questions about drink driving. Scotland reduced the legal limit from 80 milligrams of alcohol per 100 milliliter of blood to 50 milligrams per 100 milliliter of blood in 2014, from 80 to 50. What discussions have you had with the UK government about implementing such a change in London?
Personally, none. I'm not aware whether anything has been done on a national level with the MPCC, but I can certainly undertake to find out and get back to you on that. So.
Good, yeah. I was going to ask you, well, if there's none, then hopefully you'll consider approaching the government. And my second question, again on drink driving, what discussions have you had with the government, if any, over allowing random breath testing and police use of mobile evidential breath testing equipment? And what benefit will such changes bring in London?
Two parts to that question. The first part, again, none that I'm aware of, but I can find out and get back to you. Secondly, I think any tool that helps us to intervene to prevent people drinking and driving is useful and would be very, very welcome. But obviously, we'd be guided by the government and the legislation, the Parliament, rather, as to whether that's something they would wish to introduce for the United Kingdom.
And my final question, if you can be as brief as possible, can you give us a Met perspective on how far the pandemic has affected progress towards Vision Zero? We've heard from TfL, we heard from the city.
That's a big question, isn't it?
I know, I'm conscious of the time.
I'll try and give a potted approach. We actually found that it's been almost a pandemic of two halves for us in terms of policing and Vision Zero. The original lockdown in 2020 saw quite a significant drop in the call for policing overall in many, many areas. And colleagues and members will be aware that the streets really did go quiet. Now, this gave us an opportunity to focus on a range of other things where we normally perhaps be diverted into larger public order, sporting events, etc., to really concentrate on things. And our enforcement on roads at the time went up quite extraordinarily in that year. And again, I can share figures if you want, but it really allowed us to bring far more focus and far more time onto a whole range of different criminal traffic offences. So from a Vision Zero point of view, 2020 really allowed us to put even more effort than we would normally be doing into this, because my officers weren't so distracted or tasked into other areas of policing, day-to-day policing. They just weren't happening. The second half of the lockdown, if you like, 2021, has seen more return to normal day-to-day type policing. So again, a bigger requirement for my officers to take part in public order events, sporting events and stuff that happened. And we saw a return to the more normal levels of reduction. So if the question is, has the pandemic harmed our policing of Vision Zero, I would say no. The opposite. It's actually allowed us to put, particularly in 2020, more effort into it, which I think is shown through in the amount of prosecutions that have been undertaken for the fatal four and indeed other road traffic offences as well. Does that help, sir?
Oh, yeah, I mean, you can sort of write to us in due course along with Mike. My other two questions. Chair, I must ask this question. It's on funding. It is important. We just, in your absence, we heard from TfL that the road command unit gets £91 million, which allows somewhat 2,000 officers to work under you. Given the uncertainty over TfL's long-term funding and the short-term deals that we've had over the last couple of years, how important is the support that you get from TfL?
Can you just repeat that last?
How important is the support that you get from TfL?
How important is the budget?
In employing 2,000 officers, they give you some £91 million.
Okay, so the TfL budget for the last financial year paid for it paid for 963 police officer and PCSO posts. That's out of a total command in my command of about 2,200 people. A vast majority of the money for those 963 posts was paid for the safer transport teams and the policing of the bus routes, both on the buses and off the routes as well. £91 million is an extraordinary and very significant amount of money. And as already has been mentioned, the partnership is not only extraordinary for London, but it's recognised as extraordinary nationally, and as was noted by the HMI, as already mentioned. So it's a great partnership to work on. That 91 million makes a huge difference to the policing of the road transport networks in London, and I very, very much welcome it continuing along the lines that it is.
Makes a huge difference. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. I've got Assembly Member Rogers, and then we'll move on to the next section.
Thank you, Chair. Just to pick up on a point that, Will, you made earlier about learning. We've seen travel patterns change quite dramatically during the pandemic, and I was wondering if there's anything specific you've kind of learnt from those changing travel patterns that would help progress towards Vision Zero.
It's a good question, and where to start? It's a challenge. Can I give you one example of where I think there's been a really significant piece of learning, and that's around the low traffic neighbourhoods. So, driving on residential streets in London, sort of, if you go back in history, 1994 to 2008, the residential traffic on residential streets was broadly stable. From 2009 onwards, the amount of motoring on those streets increased from 5.5 billion vehicle miles to almost 9.5 billion vehicle miles in 2019. As the traffic on those local neighbourhood roads increased, so sadly have the amount of collisions, and this comes back to this thing that actually more traffic and more motoring results in more road danger. And so when we look at the sort of data over the past decade, the sort of walking and cycling casualties on those neighbourhood streets increased by something like 38%. That's almost double how much it increased on main roads, which was closer to I think about 20%, but I can't remember the exact figure. It's about 20%. So that's a real problem, this increase on local roads, and due to which I would argue a lot of that is down to increased traffic, because the figures are quite extraordinary. When during the pandemic, a whole series of low traffic neighbourhoods were introduced by boroughs across the city. Now these were borough schemes, but one of the things that came out of that, and the university did some research into 30 of those neighbourhoods in over 6 years. So this is not the ones that have been in there for long term, because low traffic neighbourhoods or things like that have been around for donkey's years for various different things and provide benefits for communities. But just those that went in during the pandemic, we saw a 50% fall in the number of casualties. So that cut the number of casualties in half within a 6 month period. Now, there is clearly, with all of these things, and that's why we come back to that baseline, I'm always worried about looking at short-term periods. We need to look at over a longer-term period because the data is more solid. But that indication that was done by Westminster University clearly shows that if we want to tackle those local journeys to people walking to school, to the shops, to the surgeries, and drive that mode shift, not being anti-car in any way, but if, 250,000 car journeys every morning in London are associated with the school run, many of those can be walked. Yep. Now, what's one of the barriers in that? That's the threat of kids being injured on those local streets. So one of the learnings I take from this is while numbers have increased and there are solutions to this, and so we need to continue to monitor, we need to continue to look at that data, but that's a really impressive change. And I'm not aware of anything else, maybe 20 miles an hour speed limits, but other than that, there's led to a 50% fall in casualties on roads, and that really is significant. So that's one item of learning I would take from certainly over the last 18 months.
You touch on mode shifts. I wonder, you talked about LTNs. Is there anything else you've learned from changing travel patterns about how you can help drive that mode shift?
Yeah, so I'll let Lilli come in. I'm sure Lilli's great on stats. For cycling, for example, while the overall number of journeys, as mentioned, as Chevron talked about, central London, the number of people going into the centre of the city is remarkably changed. So the overall number of journeys has changed, but the mode share for cycling has almost doubled. Yeah. For walking, we've seen an extraordinary change. At one point, over 50% of the journeys were being made by walking in some parts of London. So those changes show, for me, what is possible. These changes are possible. We are seeing change. And for the number of new people who have started cycling, or the people who have shifted some of those journeys, those local journeys to the shops, and whether by foot, the trick is, how do we sustain that? How do we keep that pattern going forward? So to help encourage that shift from those local car journeys to walking, cycling, and obviously a key area we need to focus on is getting public transport numbers up, because while car numbers of, the proportion of car journeys is back to sort of pre-COVID levels, public transport is still down, walking, cycling is up, but we need to enable more people to make that shift from the car to public transport.
Thank you, Chair.
Lovely, thank you. Let's move on to looking at safer speeds and streets, and Assemblymember Berry is going to kick this off.
Thank you very much, Chair. If it's okay, I'd just like to start with Lilli Matson to ask about something she said earlier before I move on to the regular questions. Lilli, nice to see you. You earlier on talked quite interestingly about the fact that you were liaising with central government, and you said you'd met on the 17th of December to discuss the possibility of, I think, legislation to allow a London-wide residential roads default speed limit reduction to 20 miles an hour. I found that really interesting. My colleague Caroline Russell, who preceded me on this committee, wrote during the pandemic asking for this to the Minister, Baroness Fear, in the DFT. And she was not keen at that point. The reply says essentially, apart from potentially the word consistently, she says she's not keen on allowing, blankets and wanting to consider individual streets. So I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that and when you expect anything to actually happen.
Great. Well done, Caroline, for kicking off the discussion. So it was, 17th December, it was members of my team met with officials in the Department of Transport. So as I said, so we weren't talking about legislation, we were talking about, and we've talked about using London as a pilot, because I don't think they are keen on legislation. So there's different ways that we could consider using it as a pilot. So that might be, I can't remember exactly what measure we're thinking, but we've worked jointly, for example, on experimental traffic orders previous year. It might be a mechanism such as that, where we've worked jointly with London councils to have pan-London-wide initiatives. Or it could be that government gives us that. So we're just exploring what the options are, but this is not formal legislative change. What we're looking at is, could we at least pilot this to see it and see whether measured over a period of time it would deliver benefits, and whether that would help overcome some of the concerns. So these are exploratory conversations, and we need to keep working with the officials. I see you're frowning, so ask your follow-up, because I think I've confused you.
A little bit, obviously, because currently we can and we have seen borough by borough blanket residential speed limits come in, and more boroughs are doing that.
Yeah.
Whereas some boroughs are essentially holding out against it. So to get it done, presumably, it would mean a power at the mayoral level rather than simply doing it street by street.
It could, but we also have jointly worked with boroughs to do London-wide initiatives, so that you can do. Yeah,
so you think there's hope that you might get all the boroughs to agree to introduce it very consistently?
So we obviously, the Vision Zero Action Plan refresh was jointly launched by the Metropolitan Police, by TfL and by London councils, and in it includes...
It is in there.
Yeah, so that is an initiative. It does require further work. One of the benefits that we receive from that is it would actually help reduce costs for boroughs, because it's a more simpler way of implementing it. Because and it's not, it's not pie in the sky. Wales, for example, have introduced this as a urban requirement, so that they've said that will be the default speed limit in that country. So I think we'll continue those conversations. I'm happy to share progress with the committee and let you know how we get on. But I can see, Will, you want to...
Will, did you want to add something to that?
Could I just add something very quickly on that default? Just sort of two things. One, the default does not mean all roads would be 20 miles an hour, just for those people who might be watching who think it. The default means that at the moment the default is 30 miles an hour. Yeah. We can make roads 20 miles an hour, which we are doing. Over half London's roads are 20 miles an hour. Some are 40 miles an hour. The North Circular, there are stretches of London's roads which 20 miles an hour would be absurd to have on some of those stretches of roads. The idea would be, if it's the default, you don't have to put a sign up every time it's 20 miles an hour, because that would be the default. So it would be cheaper. You would have to make the assessment: why is that road 30 miles an hour or 40 miles an hour or whatever speed limit, rather than being 20? So it totally flips the psychology, the decision making, the costs, and the ability to deliver this. And it's really interesting that Wales has done that. I also talk to ministers and would keep on wanting to push this, because it would be we've got to half of London's roads being 20 miles an hour. How do we rapidly accelerate? I don't want to take the same amount of time to get to all of London's roads being that. And as you said, some areas are resistant to that change as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and to clarify, residential roads is what we're talking about as the default, like it is nationally at 30. So in terms of Vision Zero, though, potentially there is an argument for reducing more speed limits on more of the Transport for London road network, which is directly under your control. That is nothing you need to negotiate with boroughs. But progress on that seems to be a little slow. It's mainly focused in the centre of town. Is there more work you might do to investigate bringing down the speed limit on more Transport for London roads? I mean, you said it would be absurd to make the North Circular 20. I mean, that's not the case with most of the South Circular, which is high streets, most of it.
So, yeah, no... So I would challenge that it's been slow in terms of the progress. That now all of Central London TfL's roads are 20, and they were delivered on time in March 2020. But the way we have gone about identifying where we should be introducing 20 miles an hour is very much to look at the busiest roads in terms of where vulnerable road users are most at risk, and to try to assess by risk and by benefits to those road users. So in the latest Vision Zero report, we set the ambition of adding another additional 140 kilometres of TfL roads to be 20 by 2024. The current number is around 80 kilometres. So that's quite a significant increase. And we have just delivered, not just within the centre, but in places like Whitechapel and Archway and Brixton, 20 mile an hour. And there are more planned. I've got a whole list here. But those, as we looked and seek to roll them out further, and we very much do want to, we're back in the question around funding, and we are at a risk of not being able to afford to do that. But you're right, we have the evidence base, we have the know-how, if you like. We need the funding to be able to do that and to continue to roll it out, because it's a really important part of making many parts of these high streets even safer and definitely more livable.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, obviously, the target is 0, and you'd think that wanting to eliminate all higher speed vehicles, contact with pedestrians, would be part of that. Will, you wanted to say one more thing? I do need to move on to my real question.
So one more thing, just on that. In some roads, it's fine just changing the speed limits with signs and with signs, but there are other roads which they really need to be engineering changes to those roads to make them feel more like a 20-mile-an-hour zone, so that they begin to sort of enforce themselves. Now, on residential roads, which might be narrow and feel like, but it's a much different thing. But actually, some of the bigger roads which TfL are responsible for require other interventions as well as the signs, which is why there's a cost associated with some of these changes, which what we rolled out on some of the TfL roads in central London to actually drive some of those to get those changes as well. So it's not it's not necessarily a cheap option with some of the bigger roads.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, my main questions are actually to Chief Superintendent Ovens, and again, nice to meet you. I wanted to ask about 20 miles an hour speed limits and what you've seen in terms of evidence for improvements in safety from those speed limits.
Can you be a bit more specific in terms of what I've seen? Because we've certainly seen a reduction in road deaths and an increase in enforcement.
Yeah, so I mean, but any particular evidence or examples that you might have, for example, of an area where a speed limit came in and there were improvements, and why that might be? Because I think your team have the insights into the causes and reasoning behind changes sometimes that we just don't see in the statistics.
It's a difficult question for me to answer in terms of individual examples, and I haven't got any individual examples. We know speeding is one of the fatal 4. So the faster you go, the more likely you are to injure someone, and equally to injure them more seriously the faster you go. So the reduction in speed limits is welcome. I pick up on what Will said around making it clear, and a default position would be really good, because I don't know about you, but I am often in a position now saying, well, is this a 20-mile-an-hour road or is this a 30-mile-an-hour road? Because my sat nav will still say it's 30 miles an hour, and sometimes the signs aren't always as clear as you can. So psychologically, that's a really good point. But any reduction in the speed of traffic travelling around London where it comes into contact with pedestrians has got to be welcomed.
Okay, that's really useful. You talked earlier about your team and the work that you did, and during the pandemic you increased the amount of enforcement. Yeah. Is there more that can be done in terms of enforcement work and activity? Are there things where you might reprioritise different types of work to do more about speed, and would that be something you'd consider?
Well, there's always more that can be done anywhere, isn't there? But the TfL have a clear position to get to a target of 1 million prosecutions a year for speeding. In 2020, we saw that at 263,000. In 2021, it was over 360,000. So going in the right direction. And I know TfL are budgeting for more investment into the Met prosecution side of things to make sure even more of people caught on camera at all the different speed levels are prosecuted, and would certainly welcome that. There are huge amounts of prosecutions are going on, and that must knock just about every other city in the country into the shade, I think, in terms of those high figures. And the fact that TfL are very, very clear and are putting their money where their mouth is in terms of getting to 1 million prosecutions a year, I think is a great signal as well.
Okay, thank you very much. And then in terms of, I mean, obviously there's enforcement. Yeah, you've got this target of doing more enforcement. Part of the reason you want to do that is to communicate to people that if they speed, they will be enforced against, and therefore you're cutting the behaviour. That's part of the process of change, I think. I spoke at the whole assembly meeting last month with the Met Commissioner about getting more information about enforcement out there. Now, one thing was the delay in the publication of the, I forgot what the name of it is, the Roads Enforcement Bulletin that comes out from Transport for London, which I think is Transport for London's responsibility, but is all information that comes from the Met. And the other thing I asked for was a dashboard, because there are lots of Met dashboards. There doesn't seem to be a Vision Zero dashboard yet. On both of those things, the Commissioner gave essentially positive promises. and I'll be following up on that. I just wanted to check if you were working on either of those things and whether you agree that being able to see the amount of enforcement that goes on would be a deterrent.
It's the way it's presented, isn't it? We all have lots of information available to us, but it's getting that across to the public. So we are part of a number of initiatives. I've got a few in front of me. Community Road Watch, Junior Road Watch, introduction of launch of speed enforcement by PCSOs, and the publicity that will surround that is all going through. So it's getting that message out. A very clear message of the 20 mile an hour limits. You know, it really slows people down. And again, I was born in London, live in London, have lived in London all myself. It's a big topic of conversation amongst Londoners, I think, about, not always positive, I have to say, about how slow we have to go on the roads now. And it's, although there are some people that are still saying, oh, well, they can't enforce it, can they, and all of that, and they need to be disabused of that position, it is becoming more of the London psyche about going slower, but again, we know, as Will said, people get confused, and consistency is really important. And if 20 became the new 30, then everyone would know where they were, wouldn't they? And you're then looking psychologically for the exception the other way around. Can I do 30 rather than should I only be doing 20?
Okay, thank you. Will, were you about to give us an update on the enforcement bulletin?
Yes. So I did actually talk to, this came up in conversation. I had a meeting yesterday. So clearly something has filtered down the chain with one of Simon's colleagues, in terms of the speed of that and how we talk about and publicise. You're right. We need to do the enforcement, but we also need to talk about the enforcement so that it becomes, ultimately, I don't want to enforce against anybody. I want people to drive at 20 miles an hour and be safe and protect people. So the goal is not to get to ever how many prosecutions. The goal is to not enforce at all. But we have to use the messaging on that, and that's something that we're keen on working together to make sure that messaging is out there and some of that data can come out, maybe see what we can do to make it come out a bit quicker.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, one of the issues with the bulletin in general is that it's a year out of date when we receive it, in any case. Moving on to enforcement, there are plans now to designate police constable traffic enforcement powers to PCSOs, police community support officers. And I've experienced this going out with a community road watch team where we needed to have an officer with us before we could do any enforcement with the speed guns that we were using as a community. How will those changes to allow PCSOs to do enforcement on events like that, will that make a difference? And what further powers might be needed?
It certainly will make a difference, because in one fell swoop it allows 564 more of my staff to take part in this type of work. The trainers have all been trained to train the PCSOs to do that, and that training's been going. And within a few days, there will be PCSOs using their new powers to do that. So yeah, it's really good news, because again, the more enforcement that goes on, the more the message goes out. Again, it's widely shared about amongst people when they've been done on a camera or stopped by the police for speeding, so the message gets out there. But also, we're quite demonstrative in the way that is being enforced as well, so people will necessarily see an increase in the amount of enforcement going on, focused between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. to begin with. These extra ones through the PCSOs, so during the really busy peak times.
Okay, that's really useful. I wonder if as a committee we might ask for early reporting back on that progress and the amount of activity that's going on. Obviously, that would probably appear on a dashboard if we had a dashboard, but if we can get early information, that would be, I think, really, really interesting to see. Actually, I have one very quick final question to TfL. Is there any plans or thoughts about bringing speed limits below 20 in areas of very high footfall? I know there's a handful of places where speed limits are lower. There's a stretch of 10 mile an hour road in my ward, but it's a private road. So yeah, what are your plans to think about really slow speeds, just where it really is appropriate?
Well, so obviously the safest approach, if you want to look at that, is to remove traffic altogether. So where, and certainly there have been lots of parts of London back to the low traffic neighbourhoods where we've seen those benefits. On the TLRM, we're not currently looking at below 20 miles an hour, but certainly certain boroughs, and I have to say, certain boroughs have definitely looked at that, and I can definitely see the case for it. So do you want to pick it up, Sean?
Yeah, if you don't mind. I mean, we've looked at sort of 15 miles an hour for the city square mile area. I think if you try to drive at 20 miles an hour in most city streets, you know, you feel like you're going fast. So I think it is about measure and proportion. The issue we faced around that has been around potential enforcement issues, whether you can actually enforce in 5 mile per hour increments around that sort of 20 mile per hour piece. That's the message we've had back, but we are still pursuing that approach if we can.
I also, you know, we've talked earlier, there's an awful long way to go on 20 miles an hour. My focus, I think our focus should be at the moment, should be expanding that. Where there is lower speed guidance, like 15 miles an hour, I think that's great. But really, the 20 mile an hour piece, I think, is the really significant thing.
Okay, that's really useful. I think there may be the possibility to look at examples from Europe of this. I think, if I'm right, 20 kilometres an hour is about 15, is that? And so, therefore, there might be some trials in Europe that we could look at. Okay, I think pass back to the chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Prince and then Assembly Member Clark.
Thank you, Chair. This one's really for Will, really. Do you think that the 20 mile per hour default limit might be less effective rather than having it in targeted zones? I think you find that a number of drivers would agree that outside a school or certain areas, maybe a hospital or somewhere, old people's home, there's certainly warrants 20 miles per hour, but out in the wilds of Essex or Havering, there are roads there that, quite honestly, doing 20 miles an hour would be absolutely ridiculous. And I think you're going to find a situation where people just won't respect the speed limit. So
I think, you know, we've got to come back to why we want to lower the speed limit. If someone's hit at a, you know, sadly if someone's hit at a car by a car doing 30, they're 5 times more likely to be killed than someone who's doing 20. And then if you look at older people, it's even more so. So if someone's hit at, you know, I think about 7% of people are killed at hit at people at 30. 50% of people are killed. So 50% of people over 60 years old are killed at 30. So if you were over 60 years old, so there's a very clear reason and clear evidence on why this is important. I come back to the point around the default for urban speeds being 20 does not mean that all roads would be 20. It would mean that you would have to make a decision on why that road would be higher. Yeah. So why would that road in the wilds of Essex, and I don't think Essex is that wild, but you know, it is. Why would they
going to the wrong places?
Well, maybe you could show me some of those spots. But it is. You know, I think the sort of psychology, as I said earlier, would be right. Urban areas, 20 miles an hour. Why would that road be different? Yep. But I come back to something that both myself and Simon has touched on in terms of consistency at the moment. It is. I find it, I don't know where one borough starts and one starts, what road, you know, actually I do know which road TfL, since I'm doing this job, I know which roads TfL control and which ones didn't, but I didn't before I did this job. And when I was driving, or when I am driving, it's confusing. So there is a consistency point, but there's also a thing that we're asking government for, which is a digital map of speed limits. Because as Simon said earlier, you know, with more technology in our cars, without that digital map of speed limits, it's very hard to actually manage that, particularly if you've got new technologies coming into cars which might sort of regulate that themselves and make it harder for people to speed. So there are sort of things that need to come into place on here. So I come back, not all roads would be 20, but we'd have to look, you know, the local authority and the highway authority would say, well, why is that road need to be faster than a default?
Can I just add to that? I think it is also worth recognising that I know exactly. I do quite a lot of walking around outer London, so I know exactly the sort of roads that you're talking about. But this is part of the reasons why collisions still remain quite stubbornly high in outer London, and why some of these roads are quite unattractive to walk and cycle on. So that there is an issue about, on the residential roads, making them feel and be safer, and actually having a wider application of 20 on a number of those roads would be really significant in liberating them and opening them up to people who want to travel sustainably on them. So I do agree with Will that there's a real challenge, and you would need to look at the roads road by road, but to see whether it might justify being higher. But there's an awful lot of residential roads in outer London which would be a lot safer if they were 20.
Yeah, well, again, that kind of makes the point that I'm making, that there are specific cases that you could make for 20 miles an hour, but quite frankly, there are areas where it's really quite absurd. And I drive around London a lot, and I have to go down towards Croydon sometimes, and it's a nightmare. 1 minute it's 20 minutes, and 1 minute it's 20 miles an hour, the next minute it's 30 miles an hour. And there are other parts of London where you see a 20 mile an hour sign and then you don't see any more signage. Then all of a sudden you realise that this car has been up very close to your rear, who's been frustrated, actually realised that it had changed to 30 miles an hour, though there's no clear signage of that. And my car actually does indicate what it thinks the speed limit is. It doesn't always get it right, unfortunately. It actually reads the road signs, but if there aren't any road signs for it to read, it can't tell me what I'm supposed to be doing, and it is an absolute nightmare. And I think repeat signage is very important, and unless we do that, people are not going to be able to respect the speed limits. There are parts of London where I just don't know what the speed limit is, but I do get, even in the 20 mile an hour limits. Certainly when I'm driving around after 9 o'clock, I've got people right up the back of my car, trying not to use an Essex term, and it's very frustrating for them. They then make an absolutely ridiculous manoeuvre as a result, because they don't think I'm going fast enough, and they endanger someone else's lives. And that's the risk. If we are going to make it blanket 20, people are going to be driving irresponsibly because they don't feel it's right or proper.
Okay, let's just move on. I'm conscious of time. Assembly Member Clark.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just getting back to this borough boundary thing, I can think of some very good examples. In Camden, where it's 20 miles an hour, and you go into Barnet, where I live, and come down North End Road, the residents have been asking Barnet for speed controls, because it's 30 miles an hour. Barnet doesn't believe in speed humps. We don't believe in lots of things, or low traffic neighbourhoods. But I'm really worried, though, that this misinformation that's come from somewhere, and I don't think it's come from anyone present, is what's consistently presented to residents in Barnet is, well, we can't possibly, because 20 miles an hour is unenforceable. And I'm just wondering if there's anything that's happening to educate boroughs who are taking that attitude that actually it is enforceable. It's not just enforceable, it's desirable, and it's what residents want, and it's actually safer. And I think particularly when you get those crossovers into boroughs is where it gets dangerous. Because if you're up at the top, if you're at the Hampstead Heath, and you're coming down, you're going downhill into Barnet, where the higher stuff is in Camden. And that's exactly where accidents happen. And I think it's dangerous, and I think residents do want to see a change. Thank you.
I think that was a point, possibly, rather than a
question.
question.
The question is sort of what's being done to educate, to battle that myth that it's not enforceable.
What I would offer you is the figures that have been enforced at 20 miles an hour. 75,000 people last year were done for speeding for the 20 mile an hour limit in London, 52,000 the year before. So, of course, it's enforceable if the proper signage is there and the roads have been adopted.
Can I add to that? Because obviously that's really welcome. But also, as part of the relaunching the Vision Zero Action Plan, Will and I worked very closely with London councils and the Met Police, obviously. We've been going regularly to the Transport and Environment Committee meetings at London councils to talk to this, and they did that was everyone signed up to this document, which is talking about that. I've then followed that up with a joint letter with Phil Glanville to all of the leaders of London councils to talk about Vision Zero and how we can progress jointly on this initiative. So I will be taking that. That was sent just before Christmas, and part of my spring will be going out and having these conversations with boroughs. And it's really good to have that we do have hard data. This is enforceable. This is part about making places more livable. I totally take your point about consistency, Keith, and I think that's part of the challenge we face, but it's also part of why we're interested in exploring this option of a default 20. Bear in mind the challenges you face about behaviour, and it's all within that context of culture that somehow through this continually raising the importance of this and just the unacceptability that your child, my child, could be killed on the road network, we need to actually change the culture of driving in London.
Could I just add that education has to be, I don't want to say I will say top down through from the local, from the councils and from an official level. Also needs that bottom up piece, and I would put significant praise with Simon and his team on the community road watch and the junior road watches, which work in schools and in communities where residents. I was on one a few evenings just before Christmas actually in Lambeth, where we went out. Local residents had been complaining of high speeding in an area. We went out with PCSOs and an officer. We went out, and the residents themselves were involved in tackling them and talked to the drivers that then got pulled over, but also the local councillors were there as well. And so the sort of this had come from the residents themselves, who felt that it was dangerous on their roads. And I do think that this can't just be a sort of top-down piece. There needs to be that bottom-up piece on actually why, and explain to drivers why the risks associated with this, and have it at a community level and as well as from a borough perspective. But I'd happily take that up with the local council on that, because I recognise the challenges.
Lovely. Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you, Chair. I think my questions are primarily for Will, but Lilli might want to comment as well. The first one is around funding that was available. And during the pandemic, Will, it was primarily from the government to introduce those walking and cycling schemes, but also LTNs in certain boroughs. Now, they were obviously hotly contested and still are, but I want to ask about the consultation and what lessons have been learned for the consultation there, and what can we do going forward to make sure that there's a better discussion around these schemes?
Thanks, Joanne. Yes, so as I said earlier, during the height of the pandemic, where the Emergency Active Travel Fund was coming into London, and there was the bailout that came out with this financial support package that was overseen in London with the Active Travel Advisory Group, and that was the Department for Transport, representative of Number 10, myself representing GLA, TfL colleagues and borough colleagues working together to deliver that street space programme. But that was, as you said, done under this guidance that didn't have, it just, frankly, the consultation wasn't there. We know how important consultation is in this process, and I'm very pleased that that guidance has been changed from government. And so now the money that we do receive from government, while there is none in the current funding deal that ended in December and runs until February, we are continuing to spend the money that was allocated from the previous funding, government funding package, which is now being done through proper and adequate consultation with communities. During this, we have learned a lot, and I think Shravan picked up on this in terms of how consultation is happening. With schemes that are on the street, and some of those temporary schemes that went in, the plastic wands that the magic wands, as some people call them in places, and some of those temporary schemes that went in, because they're there, they're being sort of looked at as a sort of live consultation and engagement. So if you go onto the TfL website, there is a whole area by which people can comment and contribute to that. And TfL are doing local outreach to communities in those schemes, and I know the boroughs are doing exactly the same thing. And there is so much engagement at the moment. I tend, because there's so many schemes happening across different boroughs, I do struggle to keep up with it all. But I know that feedback is being taken on board. not just to sort of say, well, these are not referendums on schemes, but a lot of this is about actually improving things. And one of the messages I've certainly, I mentioned earlier how much we've learned during COVID. The lack of engagement and consultation is a real problem. Not only does it affect people, the way people react, suddenly something appears on their road and they're legitimately quite upset. It's like, well, I didn't know anything about this. Why has this suddenly showed up? And that creates an adverse reaction. And you've almost already lost people before they've even had a chance to explain what the benefits are. But it also means that schemes are not up to the standards that we would want. So for a good example is some of the low traffic neighbourhoods where we've been working with Transport for All and looking at how some of those schemes can affect people with disabilities in terms of visual impairments or some mobility schemes. So that level of engagement is not just there, is absolutely vital to make sure the quality of the schemes and the way that they're designed for the particular context comes into place, and so that they work for everybody.
Thank you. Because I looked in the room, I can't see if anybody else wants to come in. So, Chair, perhaps you can interrupt me if there is. I mean, my second question, you touched it there, Will, was about those groups who are particularly vulnerable. And I know the RNIB, for example, have expressed concerns, particularly about some of these schemes that were put in with very short notice, about how they do have a great deal of impact upon their members. And so can you just say about what's being done then in the subsequent discussions to make sure that those concerns have been taken on board?
Thanks, Joanne. Yes, so again, we're noting that, as things were being rolled out in that emergency phase, the government guidance was for not to consult at that point. We know that making sure that these schemes are accessible for everybody is really important. When we go back to, I think somebody picked up on it earlier, on the inequalities that exist within the Vision Zero data, in that people from deprived backgrounds are twice as likely to be injured by road traffic collisions. Black people are 2.3 times more likely to be killed or seriously injured on our roads than white people. We don't have full data on disability, but at a national level, it shows that people who are disabled are 4 times more likely to be injured by a motor vehicle than non-disabled people. It's essential that we do that engagement, and that's why working with the RNIB, as I said, and on the London Street Space Advisory Group, but also at a local level, learning from and working closely. There was a brilliant report done by by Transport for All, which I know the committee's looked at in terms of the impact of street space schemes on people with disabilities. And their conclusions was that these are not the wrong things to be doing, but actually how do we engage with people to make sure that it works for them as well? And I think particularly where temporary schemes have gone in, and then maybe people are considering, well, should those temporary schemes remain? That's where the intervention needs to happen to make sure that they work for everybody in that space.
Thank you, Chair. If I may, just one quick final question. I recently had a meeting with Sustrans. We were talking about the Safer Junctions programme, which is extremely welcome, but they did raise concerns that at some of the junctions that have had adaptations, that I think there's certain criteria that should be met in a scoring system, but that occasionally there had been critical safety issues raised where there'd been a nil score, the lowest score possible, in fact no score, and yet the scheme had still gone ahead. And I'm just wondering if there's any comment from Will, or perhaps you could write to us afterward about that.
I would happily look at those particular junctions if that's a favour. I suppose the broader point here is that the most dangerous junctions in London are usually the most difficult junctions to tackle from this perspective, and I would not want some safety measures to not happen, because I wouldn't want perfect to be the enemy of good in some of these spaces. The Safer Junctions programme has reduced collisions overall for all forms of road users, but I'll happily pick up those individual schemes, Joanne, to follow up on that.
Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. Members, I'm really conscious of time. We've got quite a few sections to go. You might want to bring, if you've got another question, into a section you're coming up with shortly. Let's move on to the progress on initiatives, and I've got Assembly Member Rogers. I just said no, so Assemblymember Rogers.
Thank you, Chair. If I could start off with TfL, Lilli. As well as the direct vision standard, what more do you think can be done to improve safety with regards to HGVs in London?
Yeah, thank you. Well, so the safe systems approach obviously implies that you're going to tackle all elements of the systems. So the direct vision standard is directly amending the physical design of the vehicles, and obviously it has a further iteration to be strengthened in coming years, and it's incredibly important. But in addition to that, there is obviously the work that Will's been talking about in terms of on the right roads actually segregating vulnerable road users from traffic. And that is really critical that we continue to do that, because that has proven safety benefits. There's also the importance of working, we continue to liaise directly with the freight industry around what they can do in terms of training drivers and the whole promotion of what has been the FORS, or the Fleet Operator Recognition Scheme, which is now taken forward separately from TfL, but actually really drives and demands improvements in terms of how the freight industry manages itself and manages risk among its drivers. That's incredibly important. And then the final thing is obviously the wider work that we do in terms of helping educate cyclists and improving behaviour on the road network more generally from road users, so that people can be aware of the risks, and particularly when cycling, understand how to navigate safely on the road network. So it's a jigsaw. There's lots of different pieces. We can't stop pushing on any one of them, or we may see the progress we've seen slipping away.
And in your discussions with the freight industry, do you see any initiatives coming forward from them that would help with road safety?
Well, Will might want to add to this, but I would say, the freight industry have been no one, if you work in the freight industry, wants to be involved in a serious collision, let alone a fatality. It's awful for everyone concerned, and more coldly, it has a direct business impact. And so they are, beyond the sort of issues around training, around looking after fatigue, about good management of hours, that all in itself is innovative. I'm not aware of anything particularly new on the block, but I'll defer to Will. He may have some. And then Sharvin.
Yeah, if I can come in on this specifically, because we've done quite a lot of work with sort of logistics companies, supply chain in the square mile, where we're actually starting to build in their service programs to their planning applications. So we want to know how and when they're going to service those buildings and businesses as they go through that whole phase with the council, and actually trying to phase those services around, away from peak times when you've got more vulnerable road users around, actually seems to work really well. And we find that actually that collaborative approach means that you're not frustrating either party, because everyone knows where they're coming from the very beginning.
Just very, very quickly, to echo Lilli's point, the freight industry are so engaged in this space. We would have never been able to deliver the direct vision standard without the manufacturers. We're totally dependent on their data. That's a joint partnership. And, having been out with the freight industry, the drivers really benefit from this. What I'm really pleased about is part of the FORS scheme, there are all sorts of innovations popping up, and the FORS operators are trialing innovations all the time in this space. And that is a great forum to try new things. I saw something, somebody, and there are always new schemes, inventions, gadgets being coming, and the FORS partnership is the mechanism to do that. But I would just echo Shravan's piece that on HGV safety, it's not just about making those vehicles safer that are on the roads, it's actually making fewer of them, put fewer of them on the roads. And I refer back to a scheme that happened on New Bond Street a while ago that sort of tracked all the movements of the number of vehicles that were picking up rubbish and things. And I think at one point there were 144 different vehicle movements a day to pick up the amount of rubbish from all the different companies, firms, and everybody else. And by working together, those businesses collaborated through the Business Improvement District and got it down to 9 vehicle movements a day. Yeah. So for me, there is a freight consolidation piece of businesses working together, and that saves them costs. It makes it environmentally better. It cut NO2 and CO2 emissions by 90%, as well as reducing the number of vehicles on the road. So if we need fewer vehicles on the road through initiatives like that and businesses working together. But then those vehicles we do need to be safer, and that's where those innovations through the FORS partnership are so important.
Thank you. It sounds like an interesting initiative in New Bond Street. Shravan, it seems a little unfair to ask you to speak on behalf of all of London's local government, but I have a question here about what more do you think you could do to support the rollout of safer vehicles through the direct vision standard, such as in the procurement of your own fleet vehicles? So maybe you can just speak about what the city is doing there.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult for me to speak for every borough, but certainly where we're concerned, we're sort of, our own fleet is certainly compliant. We're working to the highest standards we can. I think we're at FOR's gold standard on our own operations, and we certainly work very closely with external stakeholders to make sure they are also trying to implement the highest standards. I think one thing that we have missed out is TfL's bus driver training schemes as well. And we've seen those having a big impact on road safety too, and that sort of broader awareness. The other piece we've been looking actively at from a streets and walkways perspective is also how you make the urban environment more pedestrian dominant, and that in itself, moving away from enforcement, actually drives that positive behaviour change amongst other road users, and that's something we're actively pushing on. I think that goes hand in hand with enforcement, is actually driving that sort of constructive behaviour change in road users.
Thank you. So sticking with HGVs, and you actually did touch on this. Do you think that the DVS could be a planning condition for major developments? You have touched on using the planning process on this. So.
I think it's difficult to enforce that kind of thing at a planning stage. We certainly we want their plans put in front of us at planning stage, and we certainly scrutinise those as this committee would as well. But it's very difficult to enforce that in reality. We have to trust those developers and work with them on that enforcement.
Just from a GLA and TfL perspective, all GLA and TfL construction projects costing more than £1 million do specify the FORS and clocks safety standards as part of the procurement contract. The DVS falls outside of that and is a citywide piece. Really, that should be a national scheme. It's odd that a city has to bring in vehicle regulations. We did it because it's the right thing, but really that should be nationally, because the last thing I want is all the dangerous trucks then driving to Birmingham or Manchester, yeah, and London, because that's not fair on those residents either. So that's something that, again, we'd continue to talk to government about, of actually making the lorry safety a national scheme.
Thank you. Moving on to buses, questions for Lilli now, I think. So what would you say are the major factors for the success of the bus safety standard? And do you think that the new bus safety action in the progress report will allow you to reach your 2030 target?
Yeah, thank you. So again, the key factors are multiple in terms of what's been effective. The bus safety standard itself obviously is a definition of vehicle amendments to help, and it was underpinned by an awful lot of research which helped us pinpoint exactly which aspects of the vehicles are involved in causing harm when collisions occur. So we have things such as intelligent speed adaptation, non-slip fallover within the bus, the removal of wing mirrors to reduce the incidents in which people are hit as pedestrians outside the bus. But that's matched, exactly as we're hearing, by training. For example, our Destination Zero training, which has been rolled out to all bus drivers. It's an incredible thing, actually, and we're happy to invite Assembly members to try this. It's some point, where you have virtual reality training headsets to allow you to experience complex London road networks and understand driving techniques to help mitigate the impact on vulnerable road users. So training has been really important. And then critically working with the bus operators to introduce fatigue management programs and well-being programs to try to tackle every aspect of the way the driver feels when they get in the bus, their understanding of how to drive safely, the ability of that vehicle to be as safe as it possibly can be, and then the adaptation of certain additional technologies like intelligent speed adaptation, which ensures that the buses do actually stay at the speed limit on that road. It's that combination of evidence-driven measures that have led to the improvements and will continue to deliver benefits. And there, obviously, some of those measures, we're looking at about 18% of the bus fleet having those, the full sort of bus safety standard by the end of 2022, and I think that is still pending funding. There's around 525 buses that have it now, and so it depends on the further rollout. All the other measures, such as the training, fatigue management, that does carry on, but certain elements, as I indicated in my answer on funding earlier, such as the ability to roll out intelligent speed adaptation, would slow with reduced funding.
So was that 18%?
18%, yeah. So as I understand it, if we, by the end of 2022, we would aim to have around 18% of the bus fleet with those measures in place.
And would it be your ambition to have 100% of
Yeah.
the bus fleet? And when would you
Well, that would
to
take, I
happen
mean,
by?
one of the challenges we face is with the, with reduced funding, we will be keeping old buses for longer, simply put. So that will slow the transition, but otherwise it would, I'm not going to guess the actual final end date, but it's over maybe 5 to 6 years would be the normal cycle. So currently, obviously, this is part of broader programs. If you remember, and I'm sure you've talked about our transition to net zero, where we know that with funding, we could transition to electric buses by 2030. That was our ambition. Those new buses would include the measures that we're talking about, but obviously we're now talking about a slower transition.
Thank you. At our previous meeting at Vision Zero, we heard some quite compelling evidence from a recently retired bus driver around driver fatigue and the impact that has. So I've got several questions on this. First, how often do you find that driver fatigue is a factor in incidents involving buses, and how is fatigue in general being addressed by TfL, bus driver fatigue, that is?
Yeah, thank you. So driving a bus on London's roads is a really challenging job, and we recognise that, and the driver's done an absolutely amazing job driving throughout the pandemic, and we're really grateful for the work they've done. In terms of, and during that time, we've been working with bus operators on this fatigue management programme that I mentioned. From my experience, so fatigue is not classified necessarily in the way collisions are recorded by the police, but obviously it's something when we do follow on detailed surveys into if collisions occur that you could potentially address. It isn't the prime factor at all, and I don't think it even comes out as the main factor, but that's not, I don't want to really undersell that, because I think it's many collisions are multifactorial, so it's quite hard to pinpoint exactly when fatigue might be the key issue, but it's significant enough that it's a core part of our bus safety programme, and it's why we're working with all bus operators to have fatigue management plans in place. And we're looking to work with them on, and this relates to just general well-being in the wake of the pandemic as well, a whole health and well-being sort of innovation programme, working with bus operators to try to provide the right information and facilities to ensure that bus drivers are well in themselves in their work, because that's all part of helping to manage fatigue. There are options to introduce fatigue detection technology, and with funding we would want to roll that out to around 500 buses this year, and that would be that's a way of potentially monitoring drivers for subtle signs of fatigue, such as eye blinks, and you can understand the kind of technology. We have a similar thing in trams to try to see what we can learn else about managing fatigue. But at its heart, what we really want is to create an open and trusted safety culture. So any driver who turns up at the depot and feels tired or has actually had a terrible night's sleep is able to raise that and is able to have a more open conversation and make sure that they ultimately aren't driving while fatigued.
So when you investigate or when you have oversight of incidents involving buses, is it registered that fatigue could even be a contributing factor to it? Do you collect that information at all?
So the investigation, obviously the bus operators are responsible ultimately for their safety, and we support this through the process for investigating collisions. I don't know actually exactly the different factors that are precisely recorded, but I know that fatigue can be identified, but I think I'd be better if I wrote to you specifically on that point afterwards.
Yes, that'd be helpful. Thank you. So, in your conversations with operators around their management of driver fatigue, do you talk about their rostering, and are you aware of the sort of fatigue indexing practices that operators use to look at the fatigue impact of their driver rosters, and how does that compare with other fatigue indexing done across TfL, for example, tube driver rosters?
So. In terms of discussing fatigue and rosters with the bus operators, yes. So just to be really clear of where my role, so I'm the overall Chief Safety Health Environment Officer, and a lot of this work is led through the bus safety management team. So they have the direct relationship with the bus operators. They do talk about rostering. They do talk about best practice in rostering. And we, through my team, do also coordinate a broader fatigue management program across TfL, which shares the information from London Underground, the rail services, and the bus network, so that we are sharing approaches. And we've been introducing and piloting new approaches such as sleep monitoring tools, just even within our own team, so that we can have trusted tools that we can then offer to operators or also across our London Underground network. So trying to share that information across the organisation.
Thank you. So, I mean, you've talked a number of sort of fairly high-level initiatives you're working with the industry, but are you checking how this is actually playing out on the ground? Because when I was having this similar sort of line of questioning with the bus driver at our last meeting, she said that fatigue simply isn't recognised by bus operators, and that if she called up prior to a shift to say, I simply am too fatigued to do the shift, she could potentially be facing disciplinary action. So is this actually filtering through to the operational level of bus companies?
I would say, and from my position, yes, I understand it is. And I would really want to know from that person exactly which bus company they were talking about, and we would follow it up with them. There is really close dialogue between the bus operations and safety team and operators, and they've been on weekly calls throughout the pandemic to talk about this, and they do talk about fatigue and how it plays out in practice. And I don't recognise the picture that's being described, but I would want to know about it. And so if you know, I don't know exactly which person you're talking about, but or which company, but that kind of information should be shared back with us, because we do absolutely hold this in very high concern and high focus, basically.
Well, I think the minutes of our previous meeting should be available, so all the information will be there. Okay, and I would suggest there's some actually very concerning evidence that driver gave. My final question around fatigue then, you mentioned that you're working with the freight industry and sharing best practice also on fatigue. Is there any initiatives that they're doing that you think we could borrow and we could use in our bus network?
On the freight industry, well, I mean, obviously there's a lot of, there's nothing that really, I think that I haven't already sort of talked about in terms of fatigue monitoring type information, the management of hours, the focus on well-being. These are sort of tried and trusted and understood fatigue management techniques, which we are trying to take not just from the freight industry, but also from the rail industry, and make sure that they're well understood across all of our operations. But as Will said, the freight industry is innovative in many ways, and we'll continue to work really closely with them to learn any kinds of tools that they might have.
It's interesting you mentioned that the rail industry, a lot of the rail rostering practices came up following the 1988 Clapham rail disaster. So, and that is still the gold standard for how you deal with these things. So we've known about these lessons for over 34 years. So what we heard from the bus driver at the previous meeting shows that best practice doesn't seem to be filtering into the bus industry. So I think there's something to really look into. Another question.
I would just challenge. I mean, we have done extensive research into fatigue at TfL and the bus industry, and that has translated directly into actions that are being put in place, working with bus operators, such as fatigue management plans. And I will look into detail with colleagues at what come out of that evidence, but I would also challenge that there is an awful lot of actions being put into place, and the feedback on those is that they have been well received.
So one last question. Who do you liaise with at TfL with the actual bus, in TfL, with the operators in the actual garages who deal with fatigue?
So who do I liaise with at TfL, or who do I?
Who's TfL liaise with the operators directly into the garages?
So we, as an organisation, would liaise at all levels, from the chief executives down to the managers of the garages or the bus, every level, and as well as visiting garages and meeting with people. So I'm not sure I'm going to be very helpful in that.
No, that's fine. So basically, you just want to establish you have direct relationships with managers of individual bus depots.
Yes, at different levels. Yes, absolutely.
Excellent, thank you. My next question is around training. Do you think that training for bus drivers is sufficient, and is it consistent with training that's available for HGV drivers? Thinking particularly of the Safe Urban Driving scheme that is available for HGV drivers.
Yeah, so I think I would sort of say I don't know the exact provisions of that Safer Driving scheme, and to be fair, that isn't. I would defer to my sort of the head of the bus operations to do that direct comparison. But we certainly, I would expect it to be so, and also the type of safety training that we put in place and have recommended for bus operators is very consistent and builds on what we learned from the freight industry. So when we helped work with the freight industry to develop the FORS program, which developed that safer urban driving, we then used that very basis to deliver the Destination Zero training, which I was just mentioning. So it's based exactly on the same approach, but actually is sort of gone further than that by being much more impactful and virtual. So we're trying to learn and read across at every stage from the measures that have been put in place for the HGV. I hesitated at the beginning because I wouldn't want to say, top of my head, that exactly every single legal requirement is the same. I actually don't know that, and I would need to check that. But in terms of the ethos and the approach that we recommend, through whether it's the urban driving course or whether it's the Destination Zero, they're very similar in approach.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Lovely, thank you. Assemblymember Garrett.
Thank you. I'm going to come on in a moment to some questions about e-scooters, but I had a couple of follow-up questions on the bus safety question, or topic, if I may. I think, so I've looked at this. It appears to be in common with almost all politicians these days. My dad used to drive buses, so it's something I'm a bit familiar with. There seems to have been quite a bit of work done on this already, lots of questions asked by previous Assembly members before I got here. And one of the things that I find comes out consistently is it's not clear who exactly is responsible for the safety of buses. And what I mean by that is that when things are going well, of course, lots of people want to claim credit, but when there's a problem, it seems there's a sort of Spider-Man meme situation where everything is somebody else's problem. And I'm afraid to say I've heard a bit of that, maybe hinted at today. So in your answers to Assemblymember Rogers, there were lots of talk of dialogue and conversation and talking about things. And what I want to know is, for example, in relation to rosters, do you have and have you considered having a direct power just to enforce rostering and say to bus companies, this is the safe way to roster bus drivers based on, for example, the railway industry or the airline industry? Do you have the power to do that? Would you like the power to do that? Because it feels a bit like you ask them nicely and maybe they do and maybe they don't. And if they don't, we all just sit here talking about it and drivers are still driving fatigued.
So I think that does TfL want a direct power to...
Or do you have it? And if you don't have it, would you like it?
So so I would have to ask the director of buses whether she would want that direct power. From a safety point of view, I feel that we, through the dialogue and the way we set conditions for the bus operations, we have a productive and really fruitful way of actually setting out the outcomes we want. So I don't think that for me, and that I would be clear that actually just directing rosters is necessarily the best way of getting the outcome that we want. I mean, you might just think I'm sort of evading the question, but the issue about managing fatigue is much broader than just rosters. It's about the whole safety culture within the organisation. It's about the openness for people, which I believe we are working with operators to do, to say that if they do arrive fatigued, that they don't drive and they have a safe and open culture. And that can happen with different, that isn't just down to the rosters, that's due to what I'm saying to a lot of different factors. So I don't actually know if the director of bus operators would like to direct rosters, but I think that we can achieve the safety outcomes that we need, and we have shown really good progress in terms of driving improvements in safety from buses in London. Clearly, and it's really important that you get the different evidence that you have, there's more to do.
Yes, I mean, that's the evidence that we had from Lorraine at the last meeting here was that essentially flatly contradicted what you've just said. And what I should probably also add is that subsequently other bus drivers have come forward anonymously, and not just anonymously, but insisting that we don't reveal anything about them precisely because the culture is exactly not what you've just said. The culture is one of fear that if anybody raises safety concerns, in the scenario that my colleague brought up, where somebody feels fatigued, they don't feel competent to drive, they don't feel rested enough to drive a bus for a full shift. They feel very clear, those drivers, more than one driver, not just Lorraine, and more than one besides Lorraine, felt very clear that the culture was absolutely 80 degrees the opposite of what you've said. And so what I'm sitting here thinking is that yet again we have a scenario where here, at the level that we're having this conversation, everything is lovely and you think you're having these productive conversations, and the drivers actually doing the job think that it isn't happening. And so somewhere between here and the bus cab, the message isn't getting through. And so I come back to my question, who exactly is responsible for the fact that the message isn't getting through? Or for finding out whether the message is? Because you clearly think that it is. The information I'm getting and other members are getting is that it isn't. So who's taking charge of finding out if it is, and if it isn't, making sure it is?
I will follow up with the Director of Bus Operations to find out exactly what is behind those the statements and witnesses that you've spoken to. But I also do have, because we do go out and meet with, I've met with bus drivers, go to the depot, and so have colleagues in my team, and primarily the bus operations is liaising with them every day. We do get positive feedback. We do also get the counter argument, which you're not getting here. That doesn't mean to say that what you've heard is not really, really, really important, and it is, which is why we're driving a bus operations program with bus operators. So we will work with all operators who clearly hold the employment responsibility. They're the ones interfacing day to day with their staff to make sure that it's really clear that the message coming from TfL is that this is important and we know that this does drive safety. So I can take, I'm listening to what you're saying. We will take that away. But it's not to say that there isn't also positive feedback. Just because you haven't spoken to someone who might give you a different account doesn't mean to say that that isn't true. And we can...
I think with respect, what I would say is I had a perfectly safe journey, 2 journeys in fact, to get here on my bike today. So I could give you a positive account of my time on my bike. That doesn't mean we don't have a problem with safety for cyclists. The fact that we appear to have a significant number of drivers who have a totally opposite view of the safety culture. And I suppose my question is, what is the process by which this Vision Zero plan ends up in the minds and in the culture of the bus depots? Because it really doesn't seem to be.
Well, so again, I would challenge. I think there is more progress than you're saying. So there is a bus safety program. There is a bus safety manager within TfL who sits within the director of the bus safety buses, and that person works directly with the bus operators all the time to progress the training that we've talked about, to ensure that our contracts are delivering the safer buses that we've talked about, to monitor the data that we've talked about, and that results in ongoing dialogue with the bus operators. They do follow up on investigations on any incidents that are significant that happen. They're looking at the data. So there are people scrutinizing this and working with the bus operators every day to try to drive this forward. And where it's not happening in the right way, we will take action, we will follow up.
So if someone is killed or seriously injured on the road by a bus, what investigation does TfL carry out into that?
So it's called a NIMI process, and I'm just trying to remember what the NIMI stands for, but it's similar to, obviously there was a go look see immediately to go and look at the place where the location where it happened, to see if there's anything at all within the physical environment of the road network that could immediately be amended. Maybe there's a problem with the lights, maybe there's a defect with the road network that we could address. Work really closely with the bus operator to understand what the circumstances are, and that results in a report which is examined, and then actions are put in place as far as possible to address it. If it was unfortunately a serious incident, obviously the police would be likely to be involved, and if it was indeed a fatal incident, there would be a fatal collision investigation by the police, and we would work very closely to understand any learnings from that process. So it's quite extensive, and I can think of a number of examples where we've very carefully looked at the lessons that have come from such tragedies.
So it's, I'm very conscious of time, but hopefully there's a yes/no answer. So it's TfL that carry out that process, and it happens every time there's a KSI?
No, it's jointly with the operator.
Okay.
In the incident of a bus.
But is there a TfL person there?
Yes.
Okay. I'll perhaps draw that to an end, Chair. I'm very conscious of time. A couple of questions about e-scooters. I have some written questions, some further questions, if I may, Chair. Can I write to, we can add them to a letter?
Yes, we're going to be writing this.
I think they're more sort of technical yes/no type questions. So just moving on to e-scooters. First of all, if I could ask probably TfL and on my question, TfL or the boroughs. Apparently the boroughs haven't turned up. We have one non-borough representing the boroughs. In terms of the e-scooter trial that's coming to an end shortly, how would you assess briefly how that's gone to date, and sort of what where that might go next? Perhaps if we start on the other end, since we've heard less from you.
Sure. So we haven't had sort of conclusive data on it yet. Obviously, it's still ongoing. We've worked closely with the operators providing these scooters, and obviously the city police have been quite heavily involved in trying to make sure that private e-scooters are not, the regulations are very clearly set out for how people operate. One thing we have noticed is the type of people renting the e-scooters are very different to the type of people who ride bikes or use other modes of transport. So it does seem to be a wider demographic we're able to reach through that trial, but we haven't had conclusive data, so I couldn't really say more right now.
Okay, thank you. Well,
so e-scooters, I can't remember how many times I've been asked about the e-scooters, but the e-scooter trial is a DfT national trial on this. London is in a unique situation, as we alluded to earlier, just because of the number of authorities it's required, because of all our colleagues in the boroughs and the number of highway authorities. So it took us slightly longer to set up the e-scooter trial than elsewhere in the country. We have... my personal view is e-scooters are not going away. They can't be uninvented. Yeah, they're there. It's very clear that the situation with the private e-scooters is simply not working. I was out with one of Simon's colleagues the other day, and we found one that could do 60 miles an hour. 60 miles an hour on one of those things. I couldn't think of anything more dangerous. I wouldn't want to go anywhere near one of those things. There's no regulation, and it's horribly confusing for customers to think I can buy this, but I can't use it on public space. So unless I've got an estate in Wiltshire, I'm not going to be able to use it. It's mad. So the objective of our trial was to inform that DFT national study on what role might these play in future urban transport, and how can we make them as safe as possible. And that's safe for the riders and for the other road users. We did a whole series of things in this, which is to try and improve that safety. One was you had to be 18 years old, and you need a provisional driving license at the least to register on the apps to do it. We forced some things. Rather than 60 miles an hour, it's 12.5 miles an hour a max speed in London. Now, nationally, it's 15, but we took the understanding that actually 12.5 would be a more appropriate speed for London. Silly things, technical things like the diameter of the wheels are important in terms of hitting a bump, and particularly with the regulations that we have over potholes and how quickly they need to be filled in. You know, you hit a pothole with a tiny little wheel, it's going to cause an awful lot of problems. Yeah. They're no-go areas, they're slow areas, they're designated parking areas. We don't want them scattered all over the pavements. So far in the trial, we've got different boroughs have been born. It's been a sort of gradual evolution. We now have, I think, 3,585 scooters on the ground. We have had over 500,000 journeys on those. We have been tracking the KSIs, the number of people being killed and seriously injured. We have had 13 serious injuries reported on no fatalities on the trial. So on that, suppose on the
sorry to interrupt. Do you know if the serious injuries were the rider or someone else that they hit?
I don't have all the details. Most of them have been the riders. There have been a couple of incidents where it's been someone that they've hit. But one of the challenges here is part of the reporting mechanism, because these are not registered, they are not legal vehicle types. Yep. The reporting mechanisms that exist structurally across the Met and across the thing, it isn't a sort of specified thing, or it hasn't been until it hasn't been. So that's one of the challenges. So I think, it's ongoing. It would be premature to draw any firm conclusions, and I really don't want to at this point. But the indicative thing that I'm seeing is I'm cautiously optimistic, that making the safety provisions that we've been in are brought in a less risk than the private e-scooters. We've had three fatalities of people driving private e-scooters. It is too early to say. We are working really closely with DFT on this. As you would expect, it's a national trial. And I don't know where this will go in terms of things with the DFT. My personal remembrance is that if they decide to sort of change the law and do and amend it legally, which I think they probably should do, because it's as I said, the current situation is a mess. The government needs to set out vehicle regulations. Yeah, but it's crazy that they don't exist. They need to be defined where they can and cannot go. So not on pavements, yes, in bike lanes, yes on the roads. They need to give cities the power to manage these if they're legalised as well, because what we don't want is what some of you will recall dockless bikes, where they've got scattered all over the pavements. We've seen it in Paris, we've seen it in other areas. It would be, what we don't want is for visually impaired and things to be scattered everywhere. We need a plan to regulate and make it work for the city in a way that works. But we also need to give the police the powers to adequately enforce this, And the ambiguities over the legal status make it very difficult from an enforcement perspective as well, talking to Simon's colleagues. So, I think we can be cautiously optimistic thus far. It's too early to draw those conclusions, but it's very obvious that the status quo is not working, and the private e-scooters are not safe.
Thanks. I don't know if you want to contribute as well, Lilli. I was going to go on to police about an enforcement question next. Did you have anything to add?
No,
to
nothing.
That? No,
nothing to add to what Will said.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, so from the police's point of view, obviously, for all the reasons that Will has just explained, it's let's call it a challenging situation. So, what safety measures from the police's point of view do you think would be necessary if this were going to become not a trial as it is now, if it were going to become a permanent situation? And I suppose we're thinking about the private ones, which Will just touched on, and also the kind of rental scheme ones.
There's no ambiguity about their current status in that they are illegal to use on the roads, legal to have on the pavement or anywhere else. The trial, I think, has been welcome.
But by ambiguity, I meant the fact you have the scheme ones, which are legal in some boroughs. Yeah. Sorry, I do apologise.
I'll come on to that. The trial has been very useful in terms of, in two areas. One, the input that we in the Met had with yourselves in terms of coming up with some safety conditions to make them safer, not totally safe, but safer. I think one of the issues we had a particular problem with was the lack of headgear. I understand why eventually it was decided not to have headgear, but I think that's a glaring issue. We had a doctor at a meeting the other day from the Royal London Hospital saying 20% of all serious head injuries coming in now are from people on e-scooters. Now, you touched on the lack of reporting because they're not because of all the legal problems around them. People aren't reporting when they're having an accident necessarily. So I think unless it's a very serious accident involving another vehicle or it's a fatality, we're unsure about the level of reporting. I absolutely echo the fact that Parliament needs to make a decision on these things. Are they staying or are they going? And if they're staying, what are the legal requirements around them? I've been quoted, I think, at various times as describing them as death traps. And I think the private ones are death traps. They don't have suspension, they don't have indication, they throw you off, they're very small turning circles, and because of the complete lack of need of insurance or anything else around them, they are death traps. The trial ones, we've gone a long way to see what they might be like if society decides they're going to stay, what they might be like in a more ordered and more regulated way. Again, I mentioned consistency early on. It is absolutely crazy. There's no regulation around them. We need to have some very clear lines. At the top of the agenda for me would be a requirement for headgear to be worn at all times while they're being ridden, but also that wide look at their suspension, their indication, and anything else. Certainly speed limitation. And as Will said, we've actually caught people doing 50, 55 miles an hour on them. And we've tested them that will do 60 and more. And if you hit a pothole, well, one of the fatalities, unfortunately, it was a little over 1 millimetre, this pothole, and it threw the individual off into the path of a HGV, and that individual died. So consistency, a decision from Parliament about whether we're going to have them or not, and the regulations required around them.
And in terms of that enforcement, thinking now specifically about the private ones, let's put the scheme ones to one side for a minute. On the private ones, obviously there's this presumably a sort of resource allocation issue from the police point of view. So I'm curious to understand how you think about this. That presumably if somebody is just like trundling along the road in a fairly safe way at a fairly low speed, regardless of the fact that it's illegal, presumably that it's debatable whether that's a high priority for the police. Whereas if some of the examples you've given where people are going very high speeds or they're going along the pavement, weaving through people in pedestrianised streets, I'm sure all of us have had lots of emails from people who, certainly residents, who think that should be a very high priority for the police. With the current situation, how do you sort of prioritise your resources from that point of view? How much work is actually going on? And secondly, in terms of if the private ones were legalised, presumably it would make that enforcement a bit easier if, in some of the ways that Will was talking about, say they were legal on the road in a similar way that electric bicycles are legal on the road, and then blatantly illegal on the pavement. Would that make your enforcement job
right, well, a number of points there. Yeah. Just because when we see it as pottering along doesn't mean that it can't be used at high speeds and in different places elsewhere. So although there is a discretionary approach of my officers to deal with what's in front of them, people must understand that if they're riding one of these non-trial ones, they have no insurance. They're on a motor vehicle without insurance and without a driving licence in most cases, and face the consequences. We certainly have moved to a position where we want to show more discretion to people perhaps using them safely but misguidedly. My boss, Commander Carl Gordon, has done a lot, again, with the manufacturers, who, as Will said, are flogging these things merrily. Shops are saying, well, we have signs up, etc. But, come on. No one goes in and buys all these hundreds of things thinking, I can't use them, etc.
It's like a form of entrapment,
almost. Sorry?
Sorry, I'd said it's almost like a form of entrapment, that you're selling it, but people aren't.
It's just, it's just.
Sorry, I'll come to you.
They're not playing nicely, are they? They're selling lots of things to people that are not only illegal, but are putting people and pedestrians at great risk. Well, one of my sisters is blind, and she is waiting for the day when one of these things. She's had a number of close misses. She's waiting for the day when one of these things is going to sweep her off her feet. She can't hear them coming. They're not stopping at red traffic lights and things, let alone being on the pavement. She has a great deal of fear there.
So in terms of police resource allocation for enforcement, presumably when you decide, okay, we're going to allocate some resource this week in this place on these things, your focus is what, more on the pavement? Because there's two scenarios. One is an officer who's just going about his or her job and they encounter one. Second one is we have targeted enforcement. So is there targeted enforcement going on as well?
So in 2021 we seized 4,000 of them, just under 4,000 were seized from people and taken off them, and all of those people ended up facing prosecution either for not having a driving licence or for having no insurance. We have, if my officers come across them, I expect them to be dealt with in what they see. But yeah, we do have targeted operations, particularly in high footfall areas, where we will deploy officers just to deal with that. It's not every day, and it's not 24 hours a day, but it is high enough up on my agenda around safety. As Will said, 3 people were killed on these in London last year. Sadly, people will be killed in London this year on them. I have no doubt. So they are high up on my agenda to deal with. But what I would cry out for is, a parliamentary decision about their status, and if they're going to stay, regulation around them, particularly with headgear at the top of the agenda for me.
Okay, I'd really finished, but Will, you wanted to add something, hopefully quickly.
Just very, very quickly, 3 things. The police's job is to enforce the law. Yeah, the legislation is the problem here. So I have a huge amount of time for Simon's team on how they're managing this. They could well be important role these could play in our streets and our urban transport that shifts people to a greener form of transport. But at the moment, it isn't working. But myself and Commander Gordon wrote to all the major retailers in London just before Christmas to remind them again to make that point to customers that people are buying these things without really being aware. Why would you spend 400 quid on something you can't actually use in the city in which you live? It's not being prioritised in that respect. And secondly, in terms of Simon talked about his sister who's visual impairment, one of the things that's come out of this trial already is the need for these things to have sound on them. That came out of the trial in London. The current design of the machines don't accommodate for that, but what we've asked for future ones to have that. So one of the outcomes of the trial already is positive in terms of this, in terms of how can we build these into the future. So, I think,
Okay, thank you. Right, I've got Assembly Member Desai who wants to come in specifically on this, and then members, we have got 4 sections still to go. We're going to be here probably till 1. We just need to pick up a bit of pace. Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I'll be as brief as possible. I should say, Commander, that, and Will, Chief Superintendent, at Christmas in Westfield, I saw a reputable retailer selling these things without any sort of warning notices or any signs whatsoever, unless things were explained at the till when one of these things was bought. But what I want to ask you, Simon, is about enforcement. So you said 4,000 of these e-scooters were seized in 2021. My figures are 3,600, but around 4,000. So it has been recently reported that your enforcement of illegal e-scooter use has changed, with scooters no longer routinely seized unless the scooter rider is a repeat offender. Can we expect this change in enforcement stance to be reviewed once the current e-scooter trials are finished? And can I just give a context, Chair, if I may, in terms of data, because there is some data that I got from the Mayor's office. In 2021, in the first six months alone, there were 258 incidents, some sort of collision involving e-scooters, as opposed to 266 for the whole of 2020. And in 2018, there were only 9 reported incidents. So you can see, it has escalated dramatically.
So the position of the organisation changed late in November, in that rather than being the default position, as with any other uninsured motor vehicle, it would be seized and taken off the street. And this was the same for e-scooters. The position of the organisation changed late in November that should, unless there was an aggravating factor, i.e. they were being used dangerously, or for instance at very high speed or on the pavements, or the person had been previously warned, the default position would be to speak to them, ask them to get off it, explain the law around them and ask them to wheel it home, record those details, and if in future they were stopped again, then it would be seized. My understanding is that will be continuing to be our position so far as enforcement is concerned going ahead.
Chair, my second question, I think it was answered. I was going to ask whether legalization would help make Vision Zero easier or harder to achieve. So I think from your answers, Will and Simon, with the right legislation, I think you said you're cautiously optimistic, but things would help in achieving Vision Zero. Is that right?
Yeah. I think we covered that. Lovely. Thank you very much. Right, we're moving on to safe behaviours, cycling and motorbikes. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. First question really is to, if I can ask Siobhan, actually. Do you think enough is being done to support cyclists through training, and is there sufficient money available to do this?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, from our local perspective, yes, we feel there's sufficient funding to support that level of training. It's almost ironic that we're providing training for the vulnerable on the road, but actually don't have the same emphasis on those that are the main perpetrators of fatalities. And so we feel that there probably could be a shift in emphasis on information and training for drivers of vehicles in the metal cages rather than just those vulnerable groups. Obviously, there are a proportion of errant riders as well, and we will continue that training process, but we think there's probably a broader message shift that could be put around, for example, the recent changes in the Highway Code. More emphasis needs to be put around informing drivers of that, and we think perhaps a shift in sort of mental liability in how people use our road systems.
Thank you very much. That's answered two questions.
Sorry, could I just add to that? Because I slightly disagree on the funding point. Would that be possible?
Yeah, why not?
I don't think there is adequate funding available for cycle training at the moment. We have provided bikeability skills for kids in schools, so there are 3 levels of that, bikeability level 1, 2, 3, predictably. And then there are also the adult skill sessions that we provide for people through the boroughs, and there's an online cycle skills piece. Historically, or the way that funding for cycling training works in London is that TfL has provided a budget for cycle training in London, and the boroughs have also been providing funding through their LIP, through their local implementation plans, which is a discretionary piece. The core, in 2019-20, to give you some idea of the numbers, the TfL money was about £2.5 million into cycle training that went through the boroughs and is provided by the boroughs because obviously it's a local thing. But then that was topped up by £4.2 million of the boroughs' money, to provide that. The situation at the moment is that TfL have managed to retain and keep that core money, the 2.55, which is one of the few bits that hasn't been sort of cut due to funding. But the borough money through the LIPs, which has been cut, and that's sort of been replaced through a sort of emergency priority, which has been staff, in-flight schemes and safety critical schemes, because there's been less money available. So the net impact of that is that there's £4 million less of money going to cycle training in London at the moment. So while, I think some boroughs and the city clearly manage it, but the city does have fewer residents than other boroughs. I think in other boroughs, this is becoming a real problem, not just for the amount of training that can happen, but what I'm also very worried about is the impact on the cycle trainers and the instructors themselves. Because if we lose that critical resource and they don't have enough training to sustain themselves, they go off and do other jobs, then it becomes very hard to continue that. So it's another indication of the impact of uncertain and lack of money.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to let that ride because of time. So if I can ask Chief Superintendent Ovens, why do you think that motorcycle user safety is such a difficult area to tackle, and what more do you think can be done to reduce fatalities? Up until the pandemic, it's been really stubborn, around about 30-odd motorcyclists dying every year.
Can you just repeat the first part for me?
Just what more do you think, it's a very difficult area, what more do you think can be done around motorcycle safety?
Motorcycle rather than pedal cycle?
Yes.
motorcycle. I think we're in a good position with the amount of training that is going on, but we still have the issue around the use of the motorbikes, in that we find that many of the road accidents concerned are more about the driving ability or behaviour of the motorcyclists than anything else. So, for instance, I think most of the fatal collisions involving motorbikes have been not involving another motor vehicle. The cyclist coming off, hitting a piece of street furniture because of speed, control or whatever. So, yes, more can be done, but again, this is more to do with the control of the motorcyclist, perhaps the speed limit thing, again coming into here, about the expectation of the speed being done. One of the things we had, I drew up a little list of legislative changes I'd like across a number of things. One of those would be to formally limit the speed of motorcycles in London. You know, why should they go above 20 miles an hour or 30 miles an hour, whatever the decision is, at all, and have some sort of limiter to be required on a motorbike if they were to be used in London, a bit along the lines of the, you know, the emissions requirements, and that you simply cannot come in, or you pay a huge penalty to come in, a charge to come into London if it doesn't reach those criteria.
I think that's a bit impractical, isn't it? Because I have to ride 50 miles an hour to get to central London, and then obviously ride at 20 miles an hour when I'm in London. How would you work that with a limiter on it then? That's not really a very sensible
You put
suggestion.
your mic up, Keith. You can't hear.
Oh, sorry.
you.
Yeah,
Do you
sorry.
want
That,
to
I would argue
move
that.
up your microphone.
Sorry, I would argue that it's not a very sensible suggestion, because I have to ride 50 miles an hour to get into central London on the A13, where 50 miles an hour is quite legal. And then when I'm in central, I have to drive at whatever the speed limit is. So I don't quite see how that would work, to be perfectly
Yeah, well,
blunt.
of course, no one has to ride at any particular speed. People choose to ride at speed, and these are maximum speed limits rather than minimum speed limits we have. I think we said right at the beginning that there does need to be some decision making and some political leadership around that. If we're really going to get to no one being killed on the road, one of the big issues about people being killed on our streets is speed. And if people can't be trusted to stick to the speed limits, particularly in these more vulnerable categories like pedal-cycles, motorcycles, e-scooters, then sometimes some tough decisions need to be made, and some impositions. That includes the 20 mile an hour limit generally.
With all due respect, on a motorbike, how do you get from Romford to Canning Town if you're driving at 20 miles an hour on an A13, where you've got a juggernaut coming up your backside? And in fact, that's a very good point, because around Canning Town there's a flyover which reduces to 30 miles an hour, which has got no signage other than the initial signage. And every time I use that, I have cars and lorries up my rear, forcing me to go faster, because everyone else is doing 40 and 50 miles an hour, not respecting the speed limit. There's not a single reminder on that flyover to tell people that 30 is the limit. Can I just move to TfL and say that clearly, and what I do agree absolutely with the Chief Superintendent is around training, and the fact that there does need to be more training. I have asked this of the Mayor before. Can we not, as an organisation, cannot TfL try and have a conversation with the delivery companies and ask if we can have some kind of voluntary code? I'm an experienced motorcyclist. I've got the scars to prove it, and I watch motorcyclists. I saw one last night. They're not even in control of the thing they're riding. You know, it's suicidal.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I'll pick that up. Thanks. So,
You can both have a go.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah.
Not at the same time, though.
No. Yeah, thanks, Keith. So I would sort of, I do agree with you on this, and I'll just sort of update you on where I think your messages have got through, because we've been having those conversations. Just 2 points of context, though. There is a real issue just about getting the basic training right, but the training that's set by national government. We know that 64% of motorcyclists who are killed or seriously injured in London are on smaller motorbikes, the ones under 125. And you can gain access to those with a quick day's training. It doesn't have a pass or fail. So there really is, back to what can national government do, they can really strengthen that and help us in that. We do, as TfL working with the Met Police, offer training on top of that in terms of bike safe training, which is one-to-one training, and beyond CBT training drivers for delivery drivers. We have been meeting with the delivery industry, and we are really interested in this idea of some minimum safety standards that they might sign up to. So I know you're meeting with colleagues within TfL later this week, and they can update you in more detail on those conversations. But we do, just as we did with the freight industry at the beginning of talking about safety, we brought them together, we talked about what we could do collectively, and that's exactly the same approach we're taking with delivery industry now. So I think there's some really fruitful way forward in that area. Didn't know if you wanted to add to that, Will.
Lovely, that's great. And I think what's really important is perhaps that shift, given that the riders of these bikes, their status, whether they're employees or not, was an obstacle in the past. Now there's been a court ruling around that. I would hope that you can start to make some progress on getting these minimum safety standards, because I'm constantly seeing bikes all over the pavement, people driving dangerously, and I've also seen, a young man over on his bike, when I was going home one evening, with L plates on,
Could I add one thing? That the rest of our Vision Zero work also applies to motorbikes. So, for example, all the safer speed, safer streets, and that sort of thing. And I did ask the team to look at, safer junctions. The list, the work that we've done on junctions. For some reason, people always fixate on that just as a cycling issue. It isn't a cycling issue. They're pedestrian safety, but also for motorbikes. So the evidence shows that so far, the work that we've done on those junctions has had an 18% improvement of all types of severity for people motorcycling through those areas. So, I think we need to just be thinking that the changes that we're making to the roads make the junction safer for everybody and all road users, and it isn't just exclusive to one particular mode.
One quick question. Can I ask you again, what is being done to allow motorcyclists to use bus lanes, which clearly does have an effect on their safety?
Yeah. Do you want to pick that? So motorcyclists can access a large number of TLRN bus lanes already. There isn't, as far as I'm aware, further work to expand that access, but obviously different boroughs may be interested in that as well. So that's, I think, an update on that. I didn't know if you had something more specific in mind with regard to TfL.
Last time I asked the mayor the question, he said he would do something about it. Is not the case then?
So motorcycles are allowed in many of the TfL bus lanes, and you'll be pleased to know we've now made those 24-hour bus lanes so that it creates a safe space for a reliable bus network, makes it safe for some of those motorcycle journeys as well as some of the cyclists using that space. So there has been a change in that phase.
Okay, Assemblymember Baker, and then I think on next section, perhaps maybe roll it into one or two questions. Assemblymember Baker.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, I did have a follow-up, but it was around delivery drivers, so it's been covered by Assemblymember Prince. So do you want me to go on to section 7? Yeah. Okay, so I've just got a couple of questions for, initially I think it'll be for Lilli, around post-collision analysis, and whether you could talk about any lessons that have been learned from your post-collision analysis.
So just to make sure, do you mean the fatal analysis that we are looking at, or just in terms of how we approach the overall understanding of collisions?
So specific learnings from fatal analysis would be useful, but if you have anything else to point out to, that would be useful.
So just sort of starting at the broadest level, we obviously work really closely with the Metropolitan Police to get all the data and learnings from any collisions, and then those are analysed both by area and by understanding of rates, so that we can really begin to pinpoint where dangerous areas are in our road network. And that kind of information informs the safer junctions prioritisation, as well as other work that we do with the boroughs. But when when we want to sort of really understand a particular user group, in particular, such as motorcyclists or pedestrians, we then have commissioned quite often TRL as experts in this field to delve really deeply into a wide number of the fatal files that the police will have compiled during those investigations. And from that, for example, that work has directly informed the work we did with both the direct vision standard as a previous example and the bus safety standard, because it allowed us to understand, just giving a very obvious example, that with cyclists it was the left-hand turning maneuver and it was the front left-hand bumper of HGVs that were disproportionately identified. So that kind of detailed analysis can give you such insight into the behaviours. For example, I don't want to harp on cyclists, but just going up the inside of an HGV and the vehicle design. So we have refreshed and we have more research that is looking into motorcycle safety and has done further research into this area that will be published later this year. I've yet to see it in draft, but that will be furthering the insights that we've had up to date. And we will continue to do that. So I'm just trying to think if there's anything else I can offer you. But really, it is that kind of work that drives our understanding of how we evidence. So it starts with the data, and then you go into a certain area and really, really drive into what the fatal files can tell you. I would also just say that isn't the only way to get insight. So some of the other areas that we're looking at are hospital admission data. So by the very point that you raised about e-scooters, not all incidents are actually recorded by the police. So we often look at hospital incidents data to see if there's a mismatch or if there's things that are happening that aren't necessarily being driven through the collision statistics. And we also would work with innovators and data companies to look at, our idea would be to get even more information on near misses and close passes, because that's the kind of information we really need to understand how to prevent collisions before they even occur.
Could I add one thing? Just that I think Lilli's right. The fatality work is really important, and it has shaped this. Why we came up with the update on the report and on the Vision Zero plan and that thing. But as I said before, the difference between someone being seriously injured and a fatality, as I said, is often centimetres in terms of distance of something happened, or seconds in terms of how soon they were. So I do think, thankfully, the number of people being killed on the road is going down. It's still too high, as I said, but we do need, a lot of our analysis is done on the serious injuries as well, because there's a larger number of them, so therefore there is more learning to be had, and potential patterns can come out of that in a different way that isn't always there with the fatality. So it's important we look at the fatality in detail, but also look at the KSIs.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I do think, though, near misses are, if they don't result in serious injury, very, very difficult to find out. So it would be interesting to hear maybe any more information about, other than hospital admissions, what other ways you can find out. But I don't think we've got time to go into a lot of that. But, second question is, are there any emerging technologies that you think are coming over the horizon that could help road safety objectives in the future?
We'll start and I'll join in.
Frankly, I think the adoption. If you look at the figures on, if you look at the figures on where we made the massive change, where there's been a massive change across the UK in the number of people being killed and seriously injured on the roads, it's actually inside vehicles, in terms of passengers and drivers inside the cars over history. And there's been massive technological advances, whether that's crumple zones, seat belts, airbags, all of the above. There's been far less on the outside of those vehicles. And I think that the adoption of a lot of the technology in the UK has been sadly slow, whether that's the intelligent speed assistance, which Keith mentioned comes on his car, which sort of gives you an indication if you're breaking the speed limit. That's only on some of the more I don't know what car Keith has, but it's, you know, it doesn't come on all the standard models of some of the vehicles, and isn't a default on all vehicles, sadly. You know, similar with the emergency braking. You know, in my view, some of these things should be mandatory for all vehicles coming in this country, and I think that's a national piece because, as I said earlier, vehicle regulations are challenging in there. So some of that has been slower than anticipated, and has been, you know, alco locks is available, where you can actually do a breath test to actually unlock the vehicle from the very outset. I think that would be a great thing to have on our vehicles, so that stops, you can't even start the car if you're breaking the law on things. So, you know, there are those technologies that can become advancements. Technology is a double-edged sword, though. There's been a massive advancements in some technologies that has led, I think, to more problems on the roads. Mobile phones and driver distraction in the vehicles is one of the I think you call it the fatal four, don't you? The sort of core reasons why there are problems. You look at the size of some of the vehicles on London's roads. You know, if you look at an old Mini, back in when I was a kid, and you look at a new Mini, there's nothing mini about that new Mini. It's a large vehicle. You look at the growth of the SUVs on our roads. Now, the sheer physics of kinetic energy of a larger, heavier vehicle hitting someone makes them intrinsically more dangerous. So, you know, there is a double-edged sword with the technology. Some of it is there and can make it much better. We have been very slow to bring that into the UK, and I think that's an area where we're good. But it has, you know, TfL is leading the way on one of these things. Every new bus has now got the intelligent speed adaptation, which means it will go at the speed, you know, that is legal in that area. That helps make the buses safer, but it also helps slow down the vehicles in that area because you've got a slow-moving bus in front of you, or a vehicle not a slow-moving bus, a vehicle moving at the appropriate speed and legal speed for that road.
Just to add to that, when we put together the original Vision Zero action plan, we commissioned research from TRL that looked at the impact of those vehicle technologies that Will mentioned, particularly intelligent speed assistance, alco locks, assisted braking, etc. And those were shown to have a really significant impact if they were introduced together in helping us meet our targets. So the fact that we have been slow as a country introducing those will impact on the speed at which we reach our targets. And then just the final point to note that the European Union is introducing the General Safety Regulation, which comes into force in European countries in 2022 and includes the requirement for a number of these measures within new vehicles. And we're really encouraging central government to follow and not fall behind on that. We would really encourage central government to match the standards in the UK as set by the EU General Safety Regulation so that we don't fall behind on that. And I think that's really important to make sure that we continue to see the benefits of new technology. We know that, in particular, intelligent speed assistance will be a very important measure, and we're introducing it on our own vehicle fleet where it's reduced speeding incidents by over 90%.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And finally, about the Vision Zero dashboard, how successful do you feel that dashboard has been, and what figures do you have on stakeholder groups using this resource?
Thank you. So I know Sean mentioned the Vision Zero dashboard, but this is not on enforcement data, but it's on collision data. But it's also, actually, I was left thinking, maybe we should be thinking about whether we can combine other data into that dashboard. So that was a little action I took away from this, to have a think about it. But anyway, so the Vision Zero dashboard was, we had always been providing London collision data, but this was refreshed and made a much more effective tool through the use of Power BI mechanisms. And it allows the public to get a real insight into what's happening on your road, your neighbourhood, in terms of what type of collisions. And it shows data from 2017, and it allows the user to filter it so that you know, if you're interested in a postcode or in a particular user type, you can get that information. And I've got some update in terms of who's using it. So I think, obviously, you know, there's many different potential users, but one of the key ones that we're very interested in is making sure that the boroughs fully have access to all the data they need. So the dashboard's a quick way for them getting that, but we also provide much more detailed, bespoke information if they require it. But in terms of the dashboard, it's been 30 views a day in recent months. and increased use. That's what's also been adopted by the Department of Transport at a national level. So I think we could do more to promote it and make sure it's being used as much as possible, but it's really user-friendly, and it's a really great way of just getting insight into what's happening on your road and in your area, and tracking up, if you have particular concerns, how to get more information on that. We can also, I would always say this, we can also, as an institution, provide more detailed and bespoke information if any user has requirements for that, to help them get the insight they need into road risk.
And I know personally, it's 30 users a day. Is, this is not TikTok. It's not going to quite drive that same volume of internet usage. But I know personally that every stakeholder group that comes to me asking for a bus lane or a pedestrian crossing or improvements outside the school comes with the data from that dashboard. So it is being used both at a borough level for planning, and we know that boroughs have been using that as part of the next phase of the local implementation plan and what schemes they prioritise, because they've been using it and they've shown us. But I also know that stakeholders are coming to me as part of the campaigning and lobbying for road improvements in their area, and I've regularly found that data being quoted back to me.
That's good to hear. Maybe quality, not quantity, on the dashboard at the moment then. Thanks, Chair.
Lovely, thank you. And I think we might write to get some of the detail on offences, as you talked about the alcohol lock, which is quite interesting, to really get an understanding of drug, drink and other causes. So we'll put that in our correspondence afterwards. Right, Anne, very briefly, if you could just pick up maybe the lead questions on those two blocks, and then we'll move to finish this bit of the meeting.
I will do. I'm good at brief questions. Thank you, Chair. Which national and international examples of Vision Zero do you think London could learn from? Maybe Lilli, you could start that.
So, the classic, of course, is Sweden, and I've worked very closely with transport colleagues in both Sweden, but also at an international level through the UN, actually, to try to understand what's happening nationally with different countries. I mean, I think clearly, Will quoted earlier the experience of cities such as Oslo and Helsinki. And I think that those are very inspirational in terms of the fact that they have actually at certain points achieved the goal. But it is perhaps the experience at the national level in Sweden where I think that's particularly influential is the culture point of view. They have done what we're seeking to do over many, many years, and in terms of the technology, in terms of redesigning roads, but most importantly in terms of influencing public understanding and acceptance of road danger, and it's really at a totally different level of awareness than it is currently in London. So I look to that for inspiration. But I also think probably no one city has it exactly right, but there is much to learn from many. And other cities such as Paris are doing really interesting things in terms of reallocating road space, and other, in terms of leadership. When New York originally launched their Vision Zero scheme, it was also very inspirational. But I think it's really the consistency of what we've seen in some of the Northern European cities that's really led to this visible change. But Will, you're the champion, so...
Could I just add one thing? It doesn't need to be badged Vision Zero, and a city doesn't need a Vision Zero policy for us to learn from it. I've learned a huge amount from the Netherlands in terms of the cycle infrastructure. I went on a tour. They actually have a Dutch cycling embassy where they actually provide this service for other cities who are interested in improving things. When we looked at the e-scooter work, the team did an awful lot of work looking at understanding what was going on in Tel Aviv, in Austin, Texas, in San Francisco, in Paris, to shape our response to what we would do on e-scooters. So this issue is always learning. But interestingly, people are coming to us to learn as well. It's not one-way traffic. For the Dutch are so good at some of the cycling thing, but our school streets, we now have over 300 school streets in London. Yeah, people are coming to us to understand what's going on there to make it safer around schools. So I do think this international and national learning is a two-way process, and it doesn't mean to be done under the badge of Vision Zero to actually achieve the Vision Zero outcomes that we want to see.
Excellent. And final question of the day. would a UK-based approach to Vision Zero or Vision Zero under a different badge be beneficial, or do different areas require different approaches? And that is probably a cultural question, but do you think sort of a national picture would be beneficial?
I definitely would welcome a strong direction from at the national level that we are aspiring towards zero casualties. And that would allow us to do a number of things. It would allow us to have a national speed limit map, which means that intelligent speed assistance would be able to work nationally. We've had to do one in London so that it works at London level, but why not nationally? It would allow us to have the same safety standards that we've aspired to in London for lorries at a national level. Why should that would reduce costs nationally for logistics fleets, which are having to serve the London market and other markets. And it would crucially help to move this whole issue around road culture, because I don't think, people in London are not immune to the advertising they see, to the broader dialogue about what's good and what goes on the roads. We have to move to the position that it's no longer acceptable that people should die, and that that's just what happens if the risk you take. And therefore, I think a strong drive at a national level would help very much move that along. Of course, the implementation at a local level would need to be relevant to that local area and reflect those needs. But it's more about saying that we really want to reduce risk and make our roads safer for everybody as a goal. I think that's what Vision Zero offers us, and I think it would really help.
Anyone else want to add on that? No, let's leave it there then. Can I thank our guests so much for your time? I'm sorry we have gone on so long. I think it's just such an important topic and so many different aspects. Our last meeting overran as well. I think we'll probably write to you with a few more questions. Clearly individuals have extra ones as well, so we'll do that. So thank you to Lilli Matson, Shavron Joshi, Will Norman and Chief Superintendent Simon Ovens for your contribution today. Committee, can we note the report and discussion and also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the deputy chairman and party group lead members to agree any output from this meeting? Thank you. Now, guests, do feel free to leave. We actually have got another quick item of business, so please feel free to leave, and thank you again for your time. Item 7, our work programme. Can we note our work programme meeting dates? Date of the next meeting is going to be at 10 o'clock on the 9th of February in the new chamber at New City Hall at whatever address it is in East London. Now, members, any other business I am saying it's urgent, 9A, item 9A, London Travel Watch and Transport Focus changes to governance arrangements. So I've agreed to accept this item of urgent business concerning changes to governance arrangements for Travel Watch and Transport Focus on the grounds that consideration of the report at this meeting will ensure the committee is consulted on the changes set out in the report in advance of the next meeting of the London Travel Watch Board. So, members, you've had time to look at the paperwork. So can I ask the committee to note the changes and resultant amendments to the collaboration agreement between London Travel Watch and Transport Focus, agree the relevant changes to the associated memorandum of understanding between London Travel Watch and the committee, and endorse the appointment of Emma Gibson as London Travel Watch accounting officer and a change of job title from director to chief executive. Agreed? Thank you very much indeed. There you go. The meeting is now closed. Thank you all very much, members.